The emergence of the Cimmerians as a distinct cultural and political entity represents one of the most fascinating yet challenging puzzles in ancient Eurasian history. Their origins lie buried beneath centuries of accumulated sediment in the vast North Pontic steppes, where archaeological excavations have gradually revealed the complex transformation of Bronze Age societies into the formidable Iron Age warriors who would later terrorize the civilized world. The archaeological record from the North Pontic region reveals a dramatic cultural shift beginning around 1200 BC, marking the transition from the late Sabatinovka culture to what scholars now recognize as Proto-Cimmerian material assemblages. This transformation coincided with the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia, suggesting that the forces reshaping the Cimmerian homeland were part of larger continental upheavals. Excavations at sites like Chernogorovka in the Dnieper Bend region have uncovered stratified deposits showing clear cultural discontinuity, with new burial practices, weapon types, and settlement patterns appearing suddenly in the archaeological record. The transition manifests most clearly in the metallurgical evidence. Bronze Age cultures of the region had relied heavily on arsenical bronze and tin bronze for their weapons and tools, but the emerging Proto-Cimmerian communities rapidly adopted iron technology. Early iron artifacts from sites like Visokaya Mogila and Jabotin demonstrate sophisticated understanding of ironworking techniques, including carburization and quenching methods that produced superior weapons. These technological innovations did not develop in isolation, but appear to have spread rapidly across the steppe networks, suggesting extensive communication and trade relationships among emerging Cimmerian groups. Settlement patterns during this transitional period reveal significant changes in social organisation. Earlier Bronze Age communities had favoured permanent settlements with substantial defensive works, but Proto-Cimmerian sites show evidence of increased mobility and seasonal occupation. Excavations at Belozerka-type settlements indicate that communities were becoming more dispersed, with smaller, less permanent structures that could be abandoned quickly when circumstances required movement. This shift toward greater mobility would become a defining characteristic of Cimmerian society and military tactics. The material culture that emerged from this transformation period displays distinctive characteristics that would define Cimmerian identity for centuries. Horse gear represents perhaps the most diagnostic element of Proto-Cimmerian assemblages. Bronze and iron horsebits from sites like Chernogorovka show sophisticated understanding of equine control, with carefully designed cheek pieces that maximised rider control while minimising injury to the horse. These bits often feature elaborate decorative elements, including stylised animal figures that reflect developing artistic traditions distinct from earlier steppe cultures. Cimmerian weapons technology demonstrates remarkable innovation and effectiveness. Iron swords from Proto-Cimmerian contexts show advanced metallurgical techniques, with pattern-welded blades that combined hardened cutting edges with flexible cores. The characteristic Cimmerian Akinakes, a short sword with distinctive crossguard and pommel design, appears in archaeological contexts from this period, representing a weapon type that would spread across the ancient world through Cimmerian military activities. Spearheads from Proto-Cimmerian sites display sophisticated, socketed construction and reinforced tangs, designed for both thrusting and throwing applications. Arrowheads provide particularly rich evidence for Cimmerian military culture. Bronze and iron projectile points from sites like Novocherkassk show standardized production techniques, suggesting organized workshops capable of mass production. Three-bladed socketed arrowheads become increasingly common in Proto-Cimmerian contexts, representing a design optimized for penetrating armor and causing maximum tissue damage. The prevalence of arrowheads in burial contexts indicates that archery played a central role in Cimmerian military identity and social status. Burial practices during the Proto-Cimmerian period reveal complex social hierarchies and religious beliefs. Kurgan burials become increasingly elaborate, with larger mounds covering more complex internal structures. The burial at Vysokaya Mogila, dating to approximately 1000 BC, contained a warrior interred with complete horse gear, weapons and imported luxury goods, indicating both high social status and extensive trade connections. The practice of including horses in burials becomes more common during this period, sometimes involving multiple animals arranged around the human burial in specific patterns that suggest ritual significance. Gender differentiation in burial practices becomes more pronounced during the Proto-Cimmerian period. Male burials typically include weapons, horse gear, and tools associated with warfare and animal husbandry, while female burials contain jewellery, textile implements, and ceremonial objects. However, some female burials include weapons, suggesting that women could achieve warrior status under certain circumstances. The burial of a female warrior at Jabatin, complete with iron sword and bronze armour elements, demonstrates that Cimmerian society allowed for female participation in military activities. Linguistic evidence for Cimmerian origins presents significant challenges due to the absence of written records from the Proto-Cimmerian period. However, comparative linguistic analysis suggests strong connections to the broader Indo-European language family. The name Cimmerian itself, recorded by later Greek sources as Kimmeroi, appears to derive from an Indo-European root meaning dark or black, possibly referring to their homeland or appearance. This etymology finds parallels in other Indo-European languages, suggesting ancient linguistic connections. Relationships between Proto-Cimmerian language and Thracian linguistic traditions appear particularly significant. Thracian inscriptions and place names from the Balkans share structural similarities with reconstructed Cimmerian linguistic elements, suggesting either common ancestry or extensive cultural contact. The presence of Thracian-type pottery and metalwork in Proto-Cimmerian archaeological contexts supports theories of cultural exchange between these populations during the early Iron Age. Iranian language connections present another important avenue for understanding Cimmerian linguistic heritage. The Scythians, who later occupied much of the Cimmerian homeland, spoke an Iranian language, and some scholars argue that the Cimmerians represented an earlier Iranian-speaking population in the region. Toponymic evidence from the North Pontic steppes includes place names that appear to derive from Iranian linguistic roots, though determining whether these reflect Cimmerian or later Scythian presence remains problematic. The geographic homeland of the Proto-Cimmerians encompassed the vast steppe regions north of the Black Sea, stretching from the Dniester River in the west to the Don River in the east. This territory, encompassing much of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, provided ideal conditions for the development of nomadic pastoralism and horse-based warfare that would characterize Cimmerian society. The region's river systems, including the Dnieper, Dniester, and Don, provided crucial water sources and transportation routes that facilitated communication and trade across the steppe. Archaeological evidence suggests that different Cimmerian groups occupied distinct territorial zones within this broader homeland. The Western Cimmerians, centered in the Dniester-Dnieper region, show stronger connections to Carpathian and Danubian cultural traditions, while Eastern groups near the Don River display closer relationships with Caucasian and Central Asian influences. These regional variations would have important implications for later Cimmerian military campaigns and political organisation. The Crimean Peninsula appears to have played a special role in Proto-Cimmerian culture, serving as both a strategic stronghold and a gateway to the Black Sea trade networks. Archaeological sites on the peninsula show continuous occupation during the Bronze Age to Iron Age transition, with material culture displaying clear Proto-Cimmerian characteristics. The peninsula's defensive advantages and access to maritime resources made it an ideal base for emerging Cimmerian power structures. Climate data from the Proto-Cimmerian period indicates significant environmental changes that influence cultural development. Pollen analysis and other paleo-environmental evidence suggest that the North Pontic steppes experienced cooling and drying trends during the Late Bronze Age, creating conditions that favoured pastoralism over agriculture. These environmental pressures may have encouraged the development of more mobile lifestyles and the military technologies necessary to compete for increasingly scarce resources. The relationship between Proto-Cimmerian communities and neighbouring cultures reveals complex patterns of interaction, conflict, and exchange. Evidence from Caucasian sites shows Cimmerian-type artefacts appearing in local contexts, suggesting either trade relationships or military pressure from northern steppe populations. Similarly, Carpathian sites contain Proto-Cimmerian metalwork and pottery, indicating cultural connections across the mountain barrier. Trade networks during the Proto-Cimmerian period extended far beyond the immediate steppe homeland. Amber from the Baltic appears in Proto-Cimmerian burial contexts, while Mediterranean shells and exotic metals demonstrate connections to southern trade routes. These extensive commercial relationships would later provide the geographic knowledge and political connections that enabled large-scale Cimmerian military expeditions into Anatolia and the Near East. The established Proto-Cimmerian world that had flourished across the North Pontic steppes for nearly 4 centuries faced its greatest existential crisis during the 8th century BC. From the eastern reaches of the steppe, beyond the traditional Cimmerian sphere of influence, new confederations of Iranian-speaking peoples began consolidating power and expanding westward. These groups, who would later be known collectively as Scythians, brought with them military innovations, political structures, and demographic pressures that would fundamentally reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of the Eurasian steppes. The emergence of Scythian power represented more than simple tribal expansion. Archaeological evidence from sites like Alsan I in Tuva and Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains reveals sophisticated burial complexes dating to the 8th and 7th centuries BC, indicating that Scythian society had developed complex hierarchical structures capable of mobilizing substantial resources and manpower. These burial mounds contained elaborate horse sacrifices, with some complexes including over 160 horses arranged in precise patterns around central burial chambers. The scale and organization required for such monuments demonstrates that emerging Scythian confederations possessed administrative capabilities and social cohesion that exceeded anything previously seen on the steppes. Scythian military technology incorporated several crucial innovations that provided decisive advantages over traditional Cimmerian warfare methods. The composite reflex bow, constructed from horn, wood, and sinew layers, delivered significantly greater range and penetrating power than earlier bow designs. Scythian arrowheads from 8th century contexts show standardized 3-bladed, socketed designs optimized for armor penetration, manufactured in quantities that suggest centralized production facilities. Iron-scale armor fragments from Scythian sites indicate sophisticated metallurgical capabilities and organized workshops capable of equipping large military formations. The Scythian horse culture represented a quantum leap in steppe warfare capabilities. While Cimmerians had certainly mastered mounted combat, Scythian innovations in horse breeding, training, and tactical employment created military advantages that proved decisive in direct confrontation. Skeletal remains from Scythian sites indicate selective breeding programs that produced larger, stronger horses capable of carrying armoured riders over extended distances. Bit designs from Scythian contexts show mechanical improvements that provided superior control during complex battlefield manoeuvres, enabling coordinated cavalry tactics that overwhelmed traditional Cimmerian fighting methods. The political organisation of emerging Scythian confederations differed substantially from Cimmerian tribal structures. While Cimmerian society remained organised around relatively autonomous clan groups with loose confederate arrangements, Scythian political development emphasized centralized authority under paramount chiefs capable of coordinating military campaigns across vast distances. This organizational advantage enabled Scythian forces to concentrate superior numbers at decisive points while maintaining strategic coordination across multiple theatres of operation. Archaeological evidence from the Dnieper Bend region documents the violent transformation of Cimmerian settlements during the 8th century BC. Excavations at traditional Cimmerian sites reveal destruction layers containing arrowheads of distinctly Scythian manufacture, burned structures, and hastily abandoned material culture. The site of Jabotin shows clear evidence of violent destruction around 720 BC, with human remains displaying trauma consistent with battlefield injuries. Weapons caches buried during this period suggest that Cimmerian communities attempted to preserve military equipment for future resistance efforts, though most were never recovered. The pressure from Scythian expansion created cascading effects throughout Cimmerian society. Traditional grazing territories that had supported Cimmerian pastoral economies for generations became contested zones where military strength determined access to crucial resources. The disruption of established seasonal migration patterns forced Cimmerian groups to compete among themselves for increasingly limited territorial bases, weakening overall resistance to Scythian pressure. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Cimmerian communities attempted to adopt Scythian military technologies and tactics, but these efforts proved insufficient to counter the overwhelming demographic and organizational advantages of the Eastern invaders. Herodotus provides the most detailed ancient account of the Scythian-Cimmerian conflict, though his narrative requires careful analysis to separate reliable historical information from later mythological elaborations. According to his account in the Histories, the Scythians originated from regions beyond the Araxes River and migrated westward under pressure from the Massagetai. Upon reaching the territories north of the Black Sea, they encountered the Cimmerians and demanded submission or territorial concessions. When the Cimmerian leadership refused these demands, military conflict became inevitable. The reliability of Herodotus's sources regarding these events presents significant scholarly challenges. Writing in the 5th century BC, approximately 2 centuries after the main Scythian-Cimmerian conflicts, Herodotus relied primarily on oral traditions transmitted through multiple generations of informants. His primary sources included Scythian nobles, who had obvious incentives to present their ancestors' actions in favourable terms, as well as Greek colonists from the Black Sea region, whose knowledge derived from local traditions of uncertain accuracy. However, certain elements of Herodotus's account align convincingly with archaeological evidence. His description of Scythian military superiority, particularly in cavalry tactics and archery, corresponds to material evidence from 8th century sites. His account of Cimmerian leadership disputes during the crisis period finds support in archaeological evidence suggesting fragmentation of traditional political structures. The geographic details he provides regarding battle locations and migration routes generally correspond to topographic features and archaeological site distributions. Herodotus describes internal divisions among Cimmerian leadership regarding appropriate responses to Scythian pressure. According to his account, some Cimmerian nobles advocated armed resistance despite unfavourable odds, while others promoted strategic withdrawal to preserve tribal survival. This leadership crisis allegedly culminated in armed conflict between Cimmerian factions, with the war party ultimately prevailing but at the cost of further weakening overall resistance capabilities. The archaeological record supports Herodotus's general narrative of Cimmerian political fragmentation during this period. Burial practices at Cimmerian sites show increasing variation in grave goods and monument construction, suggesting breakdown of traditional status hierarchies and resource distribution systems. The appearance of weapon caches and fortified positions indicates preparation for prolonged conflict, while evidence of hasty abandonment at multiple sites suggests that, organised resistance ultimately proved unsustainable. Population movement evidence from the 8th century BC reveals complex patterns of displacement and migration across the North Pontic steppes. Radiocarbon dating of destruction layers at Cimmerian sites indicates that Scythian pressure intensified gradually rather than through single decisive campaigns. Initial conflicts appear to have begun around 750 BC in the eastern territories near the Don River, with westward expansion of Scythian control continuing over several decades. The material culture evidence documents systematic replacement of Cimmerian artifacts with Scythian equivalents across traditional Cimmerian territories. Pottery assemblages show gradual transition from Cimmerian decorative motifs and vessel forms to distinctly Scythian styles. Metalwork from transitional period sites displays hybrid characteristics, suggesting either cultural adaptation by remaining Cimmerian populations or gradual demographic replacement through continued migration and settlement. Fortification evidence from this period reveals Cimmerian attempts to establish defensive positions against Scythian advances. The hill fort at Belsk shows construction phases dating to the 8th century BC, with massive earthwork defences designed to protect substantial populations during extended sieges. However, archaeological evidence suggests that most such defensive efforts ultimately failed, with destruction layers indicating successful Scythian assaults. The fragmentation of Cimmerian society under Scythian pressure created multiple distinct migration streams, each following different routes and pursuing different strategic objectives. The western migration stream, comprising communities from the Dniester-Dnieper region, moved through the Carpathian passes toward the Danube Valley and eventually into Thrace and western Anatolia. Archaeological evidence from Carpathian sites shows Cimmerian-type artifacts appearing suddenly in 8th century contexts, accompanied by evidence of violent disruption to local populations. The southern migration stream followed routes through the Caucasus Mountains, utilising traditional trade passes to reach the highlands of eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. This route required negotiation with established Caucasian populations, leading to complex political arrangements that sometimes involved military alliances against common enemies. Archaeological evidence from Georgian sites shows Cimmerian metalwork and horse gear appearing in elite burial contexts, suggesting that some Cimmerian groups achieved integration with local power structures. The eastern migration stream, comprising communities from territories closest to the original Scythian expansion, faced the most direct military pressure and experienced the most traumatic displacement. Some groups from this region appear to have moved southeastward through Central Asian routes, eventually reaching regions as distant as the Iranian plateau. Others attempted to maintain positions in marginal territories unsuitable for Scythian pastoral economies, leading to fundamental changes in subsistence strategies and social organisation. Each migration stream carried distinct cultural characteristics reflecting their regional origins within the broader Cimmerian homeland. Western migrants maintained stronger connections to European metallurgical traditions and artistic styles, while southern migrants showed greater adaptation to sedentary agricultural economies. Eastern migrants retained more traditional steppe pastoral practices, but were forced to develop new military tactics suited to different environmental conditions. The timing of these migrations varied considerably, with some communities departing their traditional territories at the first signs of Scythian pressure, while others maintained resistance until direct military defeat forced abandonment. Archaeological dating suggests that the western migration began as early as 740 BC, while southern routes saw major population movements continuing into the early 7th century BC. The extended time frame of these displacements created complex interactions between different Cimmerian groups and their new neighbours. Military organisation during the migration period required fundamental adaptations to new strategic circumstances. Traditional Cimmerian warfare had emphasised territorial defence and seasonal raiding from established bases, but migration warfare demanded mobility, logistical flexibility, and the ability to fight effectively in unfamiliar terrain. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian military equipment became standardized during this period, with emphasis on portable weapons and equipment suitable for extended campaigns. The social disruption caused by forced migration created opportunities for military leaders to assume greater political authority within Cimmerian communities. Traditional clan-based leadership structures proved inadequate for coordinating complex military movements and negotiating with foreign powers. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful war leaders accumulated personal followings that transcended traditional kinship boundaries, creating new forms of political organization based on military achievement rather than hereditary status. The forced displacement of Cimmerian populations from their ancestral steppe lands created a cascade of military pressures that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the ancient Near East. As these warrior bands moved southward through the Caucasus passes, they encountered the northern frontiers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at the height of its territorial expansion. The collision between nomadic Cimmerian military culture and Assyrian imperial administration produced some of the most detailed contemporary documentation of steppe warfare tactics and their devastating impact on sedentary civilizations. Assyrian cuneiform archives from the late 8th century BC contain the earliest reliable written records of Cimmerian military activities outside their original homeland. These texts, discovered primarily at Nineveh, Kalhu and Dur-Sharrukin, refer consistently to the Cimmeri as a distinct ethnic and military entity operating in the mountainous regions between the Assyrian heartland and the Black Sea steppes. The precision of Assyrian record-keeping, driven by administrative necessity and royal propaganda requirements, provides unprecedented insight into Cimmerian military organization, tactical methods, and strategic objectives during their initial expansion into settled territories. The earliest Assyrian references to Cimmerian activity appear in administrative correspondence from the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, though these mentions remain fragmentary and geographically vague. These initial records describe raids by unidentified northern peoples against Assyrian tributary states in the Caucasus region, with damage assessments and requests for military reinforcement that suggest significant disruption to established administrative systems. The attackers are characterized as highly mobile cavalry forces capable of rapid strikes against fortified positions, followed by equally rapid withdrawal before Assyrian relief forces could respond effectively. During the reign of Sargon II, Assyrian documentation of Cimmerian activities becomes substantially more detailed and geographically specific. Sargon's military campaigns in the Caucasus region brought Assyrian forces into direct contact with Cimmerian warbands, producing battlefield reports and intelligence assessments that reveal sophisticated understanding of nomadic military capabilities. The Assyrian military, despite its extensive experience with various enemy forces throughout the Near East, encountered tactical challenges in fighting Cimmerian cavalry that required significant adaptations to traditional siege warfare and infantry tactics. Sargon's 714 BC campaign against Urartu provides the most comprehensive early account of Assyrian-Cimmerian military interaction. According to cuneiform records from this expedition, Assyrian forces advancing through these Zagros mountains encountered Cimmerian cavalry units operating as allies or mercenaries for various local rulers opposed to Assyrian expansion. These encounters revealed that Cimmerian military organization had adapted significantly to the mountainous terrain and political complexity of the Caucasus region, with war bands forming temporary alliances with established kingdoms while maintaining their essential mobility and tactical independence. The Assyrian military reports describe Cimmerian cavalry tactics with grudging professional respect, noting their superior horsemanship and archery skills compared to other nomadic peoples encountered by imperial forces. Cimmerian mounted archers demonstrated ability to maintain accurate fire while riding at full gallop across broken terrain, using composite bows that delivered arrows with sufficient force to penetrate Assyrian-scale armour at considerable distances. Their horses, described as smaller but more agile than Assyrian cavalry mounts, proved capable of sustained movement through mountainous regions that severely limited traditional Assyrian chariot operations. Cimmerian weapons technology, as documented in Assyrian battlefield reports and captured equipment inventories, represented a synthesis of steppe metallurgical traditions with innovations adapted from contact with Caucasian and Anatolian smiths. Iron spearheads recovered from battle sites showed sophisticated socketed construction, with reinforced tangs designed for both mounted combat and infantry fighting. Swords attributed to Cimmerian warriors displayed distinctive crossguard designs, and blade geometry optimized for slashing attacks from horseback, while maintaining sufficient structural integrity for dismounted combat when tactical situations required close quarters fighting. The effectiveness of Cimmerian military equipment stemmed not only from superior metallurgy, but from systematic training and tactical integration within their military culture. Assyrian intelligence reports noted that Cimmerian warriors maintained their weapons and equipment to standards that exceeded many professional armies, with particular attention to horse gear and archery equipment. Bowstrings were manufactured from specially prepared sinews that maintained tension and accuracy under varying weather conditions, while arrow production showed standardization that enabled efficient resupply during extended campaigns. Cimmerian tactical flexibility proved particularly challenging for Assyrian military doctrine, which emphasized heavily armoured infantry formations supported by siege equipment and engineering capabilities. Traditional Assyrian battlefield tactics assumed that enemy forces would either meet them in formal battle or retreat to fortified positions suitable for siege warfare. Cimmerian warbands employed neither approach, instead utilizing hit-and-run tactics that exploited their superior mobility to strike Assyrian supply lines, isolated detachments, and administrative centres, while avoiding direct confrontation with main army formations. The psychological impact of Cimmerian raids on Assyrian territorial administration created problems that extended far beyond immediate military concerns. Local populations in frontier regions began abandoning agricultural settlements and commercial centres when Cimmerian activity was reported in their vicinity, leading to significant disruption of tax collection and tribute payments that formed the economic foundation of imperial administration. Assyrian provincial governors requested additional garrison forces and defensive fortifications, but the mobility of Cimmerian raiders made static defensive measures largely ineffective. Assyrian intelligence gathering regarding Cimmerian political organisation revealed complex leadership structures that differed significantly from the centralised monarchies typical of Near Eastern kingdoms. Rather than following orders from a single paramount ruler, Cimmerian warbands appeared to operate under multiple leaders who coordinated their activities through informal consultation and shared strategic objectives. This decentralized command structure made it extremely difficult for Assyrian diplomats to negotiate meaningful agreements or arrange tribute arrangements that would ensure peaceful relations. The economic impact of Cimmerian military activities on established Near Eastern trade networks created cascading effects throughout the region. Major commercial routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolian metal sources and Black Sea trade networks faced constant disruption from Cimmerian raids, forcing merchants to seek alternative paths that significantly increased transportation costs and delivery times. Assyrian customs records from this period show substantial decreases in luxury goods imports and corresponding increases in military expenditures for convoy protection and frontier defence. Cimmerian military success against established kingdoms derived partly from their ability to exploit political divisions and territorial disputes among sedentary populations. Rather than treating all settled peoples as uniform enemies, Cimmerian leaders demonstrated sophisticated understanding of local political dynamics, forming temporary alliances with kingdoms opposed to Assyrian expansion while simultaneously raiding Assyrian territories and tributaries. This political flexibility enabled relatively small Cimmerian forces to achieve strategic impact far exceeding their numerical strength. The adaptation of Cimmerian military tactics to different geographical environments demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication. In open terrain suitable for traditional steppe warfare, they employed classic nomadic tactics of feigned retreat, encirclement, and sustained archery attacks. In mountainous regions, they modified these approaches to utilize terrain features for ambushes and defensive positions, while in forested areas they developed dismounted tactics that retained their essential mobility advantages. This tactical flexibility enabled Cimmerian forces to operate effectively across the diverse landscapes of Anatolia and the Caucasus. Assyrian attempts to counter Cimmerian military advantages led to significant modifications in imperial military organization and tactics. Traditional reliance on heavy infantry and siege equipment proved inadequate against highly mobile opponents who refused to defend fixed positions. Assyrian commanders began incorporating larger numbers of cavalry units into their forces and developing rapid response capabilities designed to intercept Cimmerian raiders before they could withdraw to inaccessible terrain. These adaptations required substantial changes in military training, equipment procurement, and logistical support systems. The documentation of Cimmerian military activities in Assyrian records reveals the broader impact of nomadic warfare on established civilizations throughout the ancient world. Unlike previous conflicts between the Assyrian Empire and neighbouring kingdoms, which typically involved territorial conquest and administrative integration, Cimmerian raids represented a fundamentally different type of military challenge. Their objectives appeared focused on resource acquisition and political disruption rather than territorial control, creating ongoing security problems that could not be resolved through traditional diplomatic or military solutions. Assyrian provincial administration in regions affected by Cimmerian activities required fundamental reorganization to address the persistent security threats. Traditional administrative centers located in fertile agricultural valleys became vulnerable targets for nomadic raids, forcing the construction of new fortified positions in defensible terrain. Tax collection systems had to be modified to account for periodic disruption of agricultural production and commercial activities, while military garrison requirements increased substantially throughout the northern and western provinces. The technological exchange resulting from Assyrian-Cimmerian military contact produced innovations that influenced warfare throughout the ancient Near East. Assyrian smiths began incorporating design elements from captured Cimmerian weapons into their own military equipment, particularly improvements in sword construction and horse gear. Similarly, Cimmerian forces acquired Assyrian siege techniques and engineering knowledge that enhanced their ability to attack fortified positions, though they typically lacked the logistical capabilities necessary for sustained siege operations. The social and cultural impact of prolonged conflict with Cimmerian forces affected Assyrian society beyond immediate military concerns. The constant threat of nomadic raids created a climate of insecurity that influenced settlement patterns, architectural development, and economic planning throughout the northern provinces. Archaeological evidence from Assyrian sites dating to this period shows increased emphasis on defensive construction and the concentration of population in more easily defended locations, reflecting the persistent challenge posed by highly mobile enemy forces. The relentless pressure of Cimmerian military activities against Assyrian frontier territories created a domino effect that would ultimately reshape the entire political landscape of western Anatolia. As Assyrian forces concentrated their defensive efforts along the eastern approaches to their core territories, the western regions of Anatolia found themselves increasingly exposed to nomadic incursions. The kingdom of Phrygia, which had emerged as the dominant power in central Anatolia during the 8th century BC, suddenly faced military challenges for which their traditional defensive strategies and political institutions proved catastrophically inadequate. Phrygian civilization had reached its zenith under King Midas, whose reign represented the culmination of centuries of cultural development and territorial expansion. Archaeological evidence from Gordion, the Phrygian capital, reveals a sophisticated urban centre with monumental architecture, advanced metallurgical workshops, and extensive trade networks connecting Anatolia with both Mediterranean and Central Asian commercial systems. The famous Midas Mound, excavated by University of Pennsylvania expeditions, contained burial goods demonstrating Phrygian access to luxury materials from across the known world, including Chinese silk, Indian ivory, and Baltic amber. The prosperity that characterized Midas's reign depended fundamentally on stable, territorial control and predictable trade relationships. Phrygian military organization emphasized heavily armored infantry formations supported by cavalry units equipped for formal battlefield engagements against neighboring kingdoms. Their fortification systems, exemplified by the massive walls and gates at Gordion, were designed to withstand siege warfare conducted by conventional armies using established tactical methods. This military doctrine proved entirely unsuited to confronting the fluid, mobility-based warfare tactics employed by Cimmerian warbands. The initial Cimmerian penetration into Phrygian territory appears to have occurred through the northeastern mountain passes, following routes that bypass the major fortified positions guarding traditional invasion corridors. Archaeological evidence from sites along these routes shows sudden destruction layers dating to approximately 690 BC, with burned structures containing Cimmerian-type arrowheads and evidence of hasty abandonment by local populations. The speed of this initial advance suggests that Phrygian frontier defences were overwhelmed before effective resistance could be organised. Cimmerian military tactics proved devastatingly effective against Phrygian settlement patterns and economic infrastructure. Rather than attempting to capture and hold major fortified centres, Cimmerian forces concentrated on disrupting the agricultural and commercial networks that supported Phrygian urban civilization. Systematic destruction of rural settlements, storage facilities, and transportation infrastructure created cascading effects that undermined the economic foundation of Phrygian royal power. Archaeological surveys in the Sakarya River Valley document widespread site abandonment during this period, with many settlements showing evidence of violent destruction followed by long-term abandonment. The psychological impact of Cimmerian raids on Phrygian society created panic that exceeded the immediate military threat. Unlike conventional warfare between established kingdoms, which followed recognized patterns of siege, battle, and negotiated settlement, Cimmerian attacks appeared random and unpredictable to settled populations accustomed to more structured forms of conflict. Contemporary sources suggest that rumours of approaching Cimmerian forces could trigger mass population movements and economic disruption, even in regions that never experienced direct attack. The Siege of Gordion represents the culmination of Cimmerian military pressure against Phrygian civilization. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals extensive destruction, dating to approximately 676 BC, with burned buildings, scattered weapons, and evidence of desperate defensive preparations. The famous wooden furniture preserved in the Midas Mound burial, including elaborate tables and serving stands, shows axe marks and fire damage consistent with systematic destruction during urban warfare. Pottery assemblages from destruction contexts contain Cimmerian-type vessels alongside traditional Phrygian wares, suggesting that the attackers occupied the city for sufficient time to establish temporary administrative control. The death of King Midas during the Cimmerian assault on Gordion marked the effective end of Phrygian political independence. While later sources, including Herodotus and various classical authors, preserve different versions of Midas's death, archaeological evidence suggests that he died during the defence of his capital rather than by suicide as some literary sources claim. The royal burial complex at Gordion shows signs of hasty completion and abbreviated funeral rituals, consistent with burial during a period of military crisis and political collapse. The destruction of Phrygian royal authority created a power vacuum in central Anatolia that neighbouring kingdoms scrambled to exploit. The kingdom of Lydia, centred in the Hermus River Valley, possessed both the geographic position and the military capabilities necessary to expand eastward into former Phrygian territories. However, Lydian expansion efforts immediately brought them into direct conflict with the same Cimmerian forces that had destroyed Phrygian power, creating a complex three-way struggle for control of western Anatolia's most fertile and strategically important regions. Lydian military organisation differed significantly from both Phrygian and Cimmerian models, incorporating innovations that reflected their unique geographic position and economic resources. The kingdom's location in the gold-rich valleys of western Anatolia provided access to precious metals that enabled the development of professional military forces equipped with standardized weapons and armour. Lydian cavalry units employed horses bred specifically for warfare, larger and more heavily armoured than typical Cimmerian mounts, though sacrificing some mobility for greater shock impact in direct confrontation. The initial encounters between Lydian and Cimmerian forces revealed the strengths and limitations of each military system. Lydian heavy cavalry proved capable of inflicting severe casualties on Cimmerian formations when tactical conditions favoured direct engagement, particularly in open terrain where their superior armour and weapons provided decisive advantages. However, Cimmerian tactical flexibility and superior strategic mobility enabled them to choose engagement conditions that minimised Lydian advantages while exploiting weaknesses in their more rigid military organisation. Archaeological evidence from battle sites in the Hermus and Gediz river valleys documents the intensity and duration of Lydian-Cimmerian conflicts during the late 7th century BC. Weapon fragments recovered from these sites include both Lydian iron spearheads and swords alongside Cimmerian arrowheads and horse gear, indicating close-quarters combat rather than the hit-and-run tactics typically associated with nomadic warfare. The presence of substantial quantities of military equipment suggests major engagements involving hundreds or thousands of warriors, representing a significant escalation from the smaller-scale raids that characterized earlier Cimmerian activities. The economic impact of prolonged warfare on Lydian society created internal pressures that influenced military and diplomatic strategies. Unlike the Cimmerians, who could sustain themselves through raiding and had minimal logistical requirements, Lydian military forces required extensive supply systems and financial resources that could only be maintained through continued agricultural production and commercial activity. Extended campaigns against Cimmerian forces strained these economic foundations, forcing Lydian rulers to seek alternative approaches to the nomadic threat. Diplomatic negotiations between Lydian rulers and Cimmerian leaders represent one of the most fascinating aspects of this conflict period. Cuneiform tablets from Assyrian archives suggest that both sides recognized the potential benefits of cooperation against common enemies, particularly the expanding Assyrian Empire and various Anatolian kingdoms seeking to exploit the regional instability. These diplomatic contacts required sophisticated translation capabilities and cultural mediation, as the fundamental differences between nomadic and sedentary societies created communication barriers that extended far beyond simple language differences. The temporary alliance between certain Lydian and Cimmerian factions during the 660 SBC demonstrates the pragmatic flexibility that characterized both cultures' approach to regional politics. Archaeological evidence from this period shows Cimmerian-type weapons and horse gear appearing in Lydian elite burial contexts, suggesting either diplomatic gift exchange or the incorporation of Cimmerian military specialists into Lydian forces. Similarly, Lydian metalwork and luxury goods appear in archaeological contexts associated with Cimmerian activities, indicating reciprocal exchange relationships. The military innovations that emerged from Lydian-Cimmerian contact influenced warfare throughout Western Anatolia and beyond. Lydian adoption of improved archery techniques and cavalry tactics enhanced their military effectiveness against traditional enemies, while Cimmerian forces acquired metalworking knowledge and siege techniques that expanded their operational capabilities. The synthesis of nomadic mobility with sedentary military technology created new tactical possibilities that would influence military development throughout the ancient world. The territorial arrangements that eventually stabilized Lydian-Cimmerian relations involved complex compromises that reflected the military and economic realities facing both sides. Lydian control over major urban centres and agricultural regions provided the economic foundation necessary for maintaining professional military forces, while Cimmerian groups retained access to pasture lands and trade routes that supported their traditional lifestyle. Archaeological evidence suggests that these arrangements involve formal territorial boundaries marked by fortified positions and mutual recognition of spheres of influence. The integration of Cimmerian military specialists into Lydian society created cultural changes that extended beyond immediate military concerns. Lydian artistic traditions began incorporating motifs and techniques derived from steppe cultures, particularly in metalwork and textile production. Burial practices at elite Lydian sites show influences from nomadic traditions, including horse sacrifices and grave goods arrangements that reflect steppe cultural values. These cultural exchanges demonstrate that military contact between nomadic and sedentary societies could produce creative synthesis rather than simple domination by either side. The impact of Cimmerian pressure on Lydian political development contributed to the centralization of royal authority and the development of more efficient administrative systems. The constant military threat required rapid decision-making capabilities and resource mobilization that traditional aristocratic councils could not provide effectively. Archaeological evidence suggests that Lydian royal palaces were expanded and fortified during this period, reflecting both increased security concerns and the concentration of the political power in royal institutions. The technological innovations that emerged from the Lydian-Cimmerian conflicts had lasting influence on military development throughout the ancient world. Improvements in horse breeding, cavalry tactics, and combined arms operations spread through trade networks and diplomatic contacts to influence military practices from the Greek city-states to the Persian Empire. The synthesis of nomadic and sedentary military traditions that occurred in Western Anatolia during the 7th century BC created tactical innovations that would shape warfare for centuries to come. The devastating military campaigns that brought Cimmerian forces into contact with the established civilizations of Anatolia and the Near East provide only a partial glimpse into the complex social structures and cultural practices that sustained these nomadic communities across centuries of migration and warfare. Behind the fearsome reputation of Cimmerian warriors lay sophisticated systems of social organization, religious belief, and material culture that enabled small populations to maintain their distinct identity while adapting to radically different environments and strategic challenges. Archaeological evidence from burial sites, settlement remains, and artifact assemblages reveals a society far more nuanced than the simple warrior bands described in Assyrian military reports. Cimmerian social organizations centered on kinship-based tribal confederations that combined flexibility with hierarchical authority structures capable of coordinating large-scale military operations. Unlike the centralized monarchies characteristic of settled kingdoms, Cimmerian political authority derived from personal achievement, hereditary status, and the ability to maintain warrior followings through successful leadership in warfare and resource acquisition. Archaeological evidence from elite burial sites suggests that social stratification was pronounced, with clear distinctions between warrior aristocrats, specialized craftsmen, ordinary herders, and dependent populations acquired through conquest or alliance relationships. The warrior aristocracy formed the apex of Cimmerian social hierarchy, distinguished by elaborate burial goods, superior weapons, and evidence of extensive personal retinues. The burial complex at Kelem, though dating to a slightly later period, provides insight into the material culture associated with high-status Cimmerian leaders. The primary burial contained gold and silver ornaments weighing over 15 kilograms, iron weapons with decorative inlays, complete horse gear for multiple animals, and imported luxury goods from across the ancient world. The sophistication of these grave goods indicates that Cimmerian elites possessed both the economic resources and cultural connections necessary to acquire materials from Mediterranean, Central Asian, and Caucasian sources. Warrior status within Cimmerian society was not purely hereditary, but could be achieved through demonstrated military prowess and successful leadership in raids or battles. Archaeological evidence suggests that young men underwent formal initiation processes that included tests of horsemanship, archery skills, and combat effectiveness. Burial sites containing weapons but limited other grave goods likely represent warriors who achieved status through personal achievement rather than inherited position. The prevalence of weapon burials across all social levels indicates that military capability was considered essential for adult male identity within Cimmerian culture. The role of horse-centered pastoralism in Cimmerian society extended far beyond simple economic subsistence to encompass fundamental aspects of social identity, religious practice, and political organization. Horses represented not merely transportation or military assets, but symbols of social status, spiritual power, and cultural continuity, connecting Cimmerian communities to their ancestral traditions. Archaeological analysis of horse remains from Cimmerian sites reveals sophisticated breeding programs that produced animals optimized for specific purposes, including warfare, long-distance travel, ceremonial display, and dairy production. Cimmerian herding practices required extensive knowledge of seasonal grazing patterns, water sources, and territorial boundaries that enabled sustainable exploitation of steppe environments across vast geographic ranges. The mobility demands of pastoral nomadism created social structures emphasizing portable wealth, flexible kinship networks, and decision-making processes that could adapt rapidly to changing environmental or political circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian communities maintained detailed oral traditions, preserving geographical knowledge, genealogical information, and cultural practices across multiple generations of migration and settlement. The integration of agricultural populations into Cimmerian society created complex relationships between nomadic and sedentary economic systems. Rather than simply destroying agricultural settlements, successful Cimmerian groups often incorporated farming communities as dependent allies, who provided grain, manufactured goods, and specialized services in exchange for military protection and access to pastoral products. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Caucasus region shows mixed assemblages containing both nomadic and agricultural material culture, suggesting sustained interaction rather than simple conquest and replacement. Religious beliefs and practices among the Cimmerians combined traditional steppe spiritual traditions with adaptations reflecting their contact with diverse cultural groups during their migrations. Archaeological evidence suggests that sky god worship formed the central element of Cimmerian religious practice, with particular emphasis on deities associated with warfare, horses, and atmospheric phenomena. Ritual deposits found at Cimmerian sites often include weapons, horse gear, and precious metals buried in elevated locations that suggest offerings to celestial powers. Ancestor veneration played a crucial role in maintaining Cimmerian cultural identity across the disruptions of migration and warfare. Elaborate burial practices, including the construction of substantial kurgan mounds and the inclusion of complete horse sacrifices, demonstrate beliefs in continued spiritual existence and the ongoing influence of deceased leaders on community welfare. The investment of substantial resources in funeral ceremonies indicates that proper treatment of the dead was considered essential for maintaining supernatural protection and cultural continuity. Shamanic traditions within Cimmerian society provided spiritual guidance, medical treatment, and ritual mediation between human communities and supernatural forces. Archaeological evidence for shamanic practices includes specialized grave goods such as bronze mirrors, ritual vessels, and animal bone implements that appear in burials of individuals who likely served religious functions within their communities. The presence of psychoactive substances in some burial contexts suggests that altered consciousness states played important roles in Cimmerian religious practices. The material culture of Cimmerian society reflects both their nomadic lifestyle requirements and their sophisticated artistic traditions. Metalwork represents the most distinctive and technically accomplished aspect of Cimmerian craftsmanship, with bronze and iron objects displaying decorative motifs that combine geometric patterns with stylized animal representations. The famous Kelerm mirror, decorated with intricate animal combat scenes, demonstrates the high level of artistic achievement possible within nomadic societies, despite their limited access to permanent workshops and specialized tools. Cimmerian metalworking techniques incorporated innovations derived from contact with various sedentary cultures, while maintaining distinctive stylistic characteristics that mark their ethnic identity. Iron weapons from Cimmerian sites show sophisticated understanding of differential heat treatment, with hardened cutting edges welded to flexible cores that provided optimal performance characteristics for mounted combat. Bronze ornaments and horse gear display complex casting techniques and surface decoration that required considerable technical skill and artistic training. Horse equipment represented perhaps the most technically demanding and culturally significant category of Cimmerian material culture. Bronze and iron horse bits from archaeological contexts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of equine anatomy and behaviour, with carefully designed cheek pieces and mouthpieces that maximize rider control while minimizing injury to the animal. Decorative elements on horse gear often incorporated religious symbolism and artistic motifs that reflected the spiritual significance of horses within Cimmerian culture. Weapons technology among the Cimmerians emphasized portability, durability, and effectiveness in mounted combat situations. The characteristic Cimmerian sword, with its distinctive crossguard and pommel design, represented an optimal balance between cutting effectiveness and structural integrity that made it suitable for both mounted and dismounted combat. Archaeological analysis reveals that Cimmerian swords were manufactured using sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produced blades capable of maintaining sharp edges through extended combat use, while retaining sufficient flexibility to absorb impact stresses without breaking. Archery equipment held special significance within Cimmerian military culture, with composite bows representing both practical weapons and symbols of warrior status. The construction of effective composite bows required specialized knowledge of materials, adhesives, and assembly techniques that was transmitted through formal apprenticeship systems. Archaeological evidence suggests that bowmaking represented a specialized craft practiced by particular individuals within Cimmerian communities, with finished bows serving as valuable trade goods and diplomatic gifts. Artistic motifs found on Cimmerian metalwork and other decorated objects reveal complex symbolic systems that encoded cultural values, religious beliefs, and social relationships. Animal combat scenes, particularly involving predators attacking herbivores, appear frequently on bronze mirrors, belt plaques, and weapon decorations. These motifs likely represented more than simple decorative elements, serving as visual narratives that reinforced cultural values regarding courage, strength, and the natural order of dominance relationships. Gender roles within Cimmerian society, while difficult to reconstruct from limited archaeological evidence, appear to have been more flexible than those typical of many ancient civilizations. Female burials containing weapons and horse gear suggest that women could achieve warrior status under certain circumstances, though such cases remain exceptional rather than normative. The burial of a female warrior at Chertomlik, complete with iron sword, bronze armour elements, and elaborate horse gear, demonstrates that Cimmerian society permitted female participation in military activities when individual circumstances warranted such roles. Family structures among the Cimmerians emphasised extended kinship networks that could provide mutual support during the challenges of nomadic life and military campaigns. Archaeological evidence suggests that burial practices reflected complex family relationships, with multiple generations sometimes interred in single kurgan complexes that served as focal points for ongoing ritual activities. The investment required for substantial burial monuments indicates that family groups possess sufficient resources and social cohesion to coordinate major construction projects. Marriage practices within Cimmerian society likely involved complex negotiations between family groups that considered factors including military alliances, economic resources, and genealogical connections. The presence of foreign luxury goods in female burials suggests that marriage relationships sometimes involved extensive gift exchanges that strengthened political and economic ties between different communities. Archaeological evidence indicates that some high-status women possessed personal wealth in the form of jewellery, textiles, and ceremonial objects that may have represented dowry arrangements or inherited property. Child-rearing practices among the Cimmerians emphasised early development of skills necessary for nomadic life, including horsemanship, animal husbandry, and basic military training. Archaeological evidence suggests that children received miniature versions of adult equipment, including small bows, knives, and horse gear, that enabled them to participate in community activities while developing necessary competences. The early age at which individuals received adult burial treatment indicates that social maturity was achieved relatively quickly within Cimmerian society. The educational systems that transmitted cultural knowledge across generations relied primarily on oral traditions maintained by specialized individuals who preserved genealogies, territorial information, religious practices, and technical knowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain individuals within Cimmerian communities possessed extensive collections of specialized equipment, including bronze vessels, ritual implements, and decorative objects that may have served as memory aids for oral instruction. The consistency of artistic motifs and technical practices across widely separated Cimmerian sites indicates that effective systems existed for maintaining cultural continuity despite geographic dispersion. Craft specialization within Cimmerian society produced individuals capable of manufacturing the sophisticated metalwork, textiles, and other goods that characterize their material culture. Archaeological evidence suggests that skilled craftsmen enjoyed elevated social status, and may have moved between different communities to practice their trades. The technical quality of Cimmerian metalwork required years of training and access to specialized tools and materials that could only be maintained through sustained community support. The sophisticated material culture and social hierarchies that defined Cimmerian society found their most dynamic expression in military organization systems that revolutionized warfare across the ancient world. The transformation of traditional Bronze Age combat methods through Cimmerian innovations created tactical approaches that would influence military development from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Archaeological evidence from weapon caches, battlefield sites, and elite burials reveals military systems far more complex than the simple raiding bands described in contemporary written sources. demonstrating organizational capabilities that enabled small nomadic populations to challenge the greatest empires of their time. The foundation of Cimmerian military effectiveness rested on the revolutionary integration of mounted archery, with coordinated cavalry tactics that maximized the advantages of superior mobility while minimizing the vulnerabilities inherent in nomadic warfare. Traditional steppe combat had emphasized individual warrior prowess and small group raids, but Cimmerian military development produced tactical formations capable of coordinated maneuvers involving hundreds of mounted warriors operating as unified combat units. Archaeological analysis of arrowhead distributions at battle sites reveals firing patterns consistent with organized volleys rather than random individual shooting, indicating disciplined training and battlefield coordination that required sophisticated command structures. The composite bow represented the technological cornerstone of Cimmerian military supremacy, incorporating engineering principles that delivered unprecedented range and penetrating power compared to earlier archery systems. Construction techniques involved laminated layers of horn, wood, and sinew bonded with specially prepared adhesives that created weapons capable of propelling arrows with sufficient force to penetrate bronze armour at distances exceeding 200 meters. Archaeological examination of bow fragments from Cimmerian sites reveals standardized dimensions and construction methods that suggest centralized production facilities capable of equipping large military formations with uniform equipment specifications. Cimmerian arrowhead technology demonstrated remarkable sophistication in both metallurgical techniques and tactical design optimization. Three-bladed socketed points manufactured from high-carbon iron showed evidence of systematic heat treatment that produced hardened cutting edges while maintaining flexible tangs that prevented breakage on impact. The distinctive triangular cross-section of Cimmerian arrowheads created wounds that were difficult to treat and caused maximum tissue damage, while the socketed construction enabled rapid field replacement of damaged points during extended campaigns. Archaeological evidence suggests that individual warriors carried specialized arrow types optimized for different tactical situations, including armor-piercing points for heavily protected opponents and broad-headed hunting points for unarmored targets. The development of specialized horse gear represented another crucial innovation that enabled Cimmerian military advantages over contemporary cavalry forces. Bronze and iron horse bits from archaeological contexts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of equine anatomy and behavior, with carefully engineered cheek pieces that provided maximum control while minimizing injury to the animal. The distinctive Cimmerian bit design featured jointed mouthpieces with leverage mechanisms that amplified rider commands, enabling precise maneuvering during complex battlefield evolutions. Saddle technology, though poorly preserved in the archaeological record, appears to have incorporated padding and stirrup systems that provided stability for mounted archery while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid mounting and dismounting. Cimmerian sword technology synthesized metallurgical innovations with tactical requirements specific to mounted combat situations. The characteristic Echinike's sword featured a straight double-edged blade approximately 60 centimeters in length, with a distinctive crossguard and pommel design that provided optimal balance for single-handed use from horseback. Archaeological analysis reveals sophisticated construction techniques involving pattern-welded blades that combined hardened steel cutting edges with flexible iron cores, creating weapons that maintained sharp edges through extended combat use, while possessing sufficient structural integrity to withstand the impact stresses of mounted warfare. The crossguard design prevented the hand from sliding onto the blade during thrusting attacks while providing protection against enemy weapons, while the heavy pommel served as a counterweight that enhanced blade control and could function as a striking weapon in close combat. Spear technology among the Cimmerians emphasized versatility and portability suited to the demands of mounted warfare. Archaeological evidence reveals two distinct spear types: longer weapons designed for mounted combat and shorter javelins optimized for throwing from horseback. The mounted combat spears featured iron points with reinforced sockets and carefully balanced wooden shafts that provided optimal reach while remaining manageable for single-handed use. Javelin points showed distinctive barbed designs that made removal from wounds extremely difficult, maximizing the psychological impact of these weapons while creating tactical advantages through the disruption they caused in enemy formations. Defensive equipment among Cimmerian warriors balanced protection requirements with the mobility demands of nomadic warfare. Scale armour constructed from bronze or iron plates sewn onto leather backing provided effective protection against arrows and slashing attacks while maintaining sufficient flexibility for mounted combat. Archaeological evidence suggests that armour coverage varied according to warrior status and tactical role, with elite warriors possessing more extensive protection including arm guards, helmets, and horse armour. The distinctive Cimmerian helmet design featured a conical bronze construction, with cheek guards and neck protection, often decorated with animal motifs that reflected both artistic traditions and religious beliefs. The tactical employment of these weapon systems created military capabilities that fundamentally altered the balance of power across the ancient Near East. Cimmerian military doctrine emphasized rapid concentration of forces at decisive points, utilizing superior strategic mobility to achieve local numerical superiority, even when overall force ratios favored their opponents. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites reveals tactical patterns consistent with coordinated attacks by multiple cavalry units operating in coordination, with arrowhead distributions indicating systematic suppression of enemy formations, followed by close combat engagements using spears and swords. The logistics of nomadic warfare required innovative solutions to supply and maintenance challenges that differed substantially from those facing sedentary armies. Cimmerian military forces operated with minimal baggage trains, carrying essential equipment on pack animals while utilizing captured resources and local procurement to sustain extended campaigns. Archaeological evidence suggests that weapon maintenance was conducted by specialized smiths who accompanied military expeditions, with portable forges and toolkits that enabled field repairs and equipment replacement. The standardization of weapon designs facilitated this maintenance system by ensuring that replacement parts could be manufactured using standardized specifications. Seasonal campaign patterns among the Cimmerians reflected both environmental constraints and tactical opportunities that influenced military planning and strategic objectives. Spring campaigns typically focused on raids against agricultural settlements during planting seasons, when disruption of farming activities created maximum economic damage with minimal military resistance. Summer operations emphasized longer-range expeditions against major urban centers and commercial routes, taking advantage of favorable weather conditions and abundant grazing for cavalry mounts. Autumn campaigns concentrated on resource acquisition through raids against harvest activities and tribute collection from subordinated populations. Winter periods were generally devoted to equipment maintenance, training activities, and political negotiations within Cimmerian tribal confederations. Supply methods for Cimmerian military forces relied heavily on captured livestock, tribute arrangements with subordinated populations, and systematic exploitation of trade routes and commercial centres. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian forces maintained sophisticated intelligence networks that provided advanced information about enemy movements, resource locations, and political developments that influenced tactical planning. The ability to sustain military operations across vast geographic ranges without established supply bases required detailed knowledge of terrain features, water sources, and seasonal resource availability that was transmitted through oral traditions maintained by experienced campaign leaders. The command structure of Cimmerian military forces reflected the decentralized political organization of nomadic society, while incorporating hierarchical elements necessary for coordinated tactical operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that warbands typically operated under the authority of experienced military leaders whose status derived from demonstrated success in previous campaigns, rather than hereditary position. These war chiefs possessed authority to make tactical decisions and negotiate temporary alliances, but major strategic decisions required consultation with councils of experienced warriors and tribal representatives. Training systems within Cimmerian society emphasized early development of military skills through participation in hunting activities, mock combat exercises, and graduated involvement in actual military operations. Archaeological evidence indicates that young warriors received specialized equipment appropriate to their training level, including lighter bows, shorter swords, and simplified armor systems that enabled skill development while providing adequate protection. The progression from hunting to raiding to major military campaigns created experienced warrior cadres capable of training new recruits while maintaining the tactical knowledge necessary for complex military operations. The integration of different tribal groups within Cimmerian military formations required coordination mechanisms that transcended traditional kinship boundaries while respecting tribal autonomy and cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that intertribal military cooperation involved formal alliance ceremonies that included weapon exchanges, oath-taking rituals, and the establishment of unified command structures for specific campaigns. These temporary military confederations could mobilize substantial forces for major operations, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid dispersal when tactical situations required independent action by component units. Comparative analysis with contemporary steppe peoples reveals that Cimmerian military innovations influenced tactical development across the Eurasian grasslands. The Scythians, who eventually displaced Cimmerian populations from their original homeland, adopted many Cimmerian weapons technologies and tactical approaches while incorporating their own innovations in political organization and strategic planning. Archaeological evidence from Scythian sites shows clear continuities with Cimmerian military culture, particularly in archery technology, horse gear design, and cavalry tactics. The influence of Cimmerian military innovations extended far beyond the immediate steppe environment to affect warfare throughout the ancient world. The effectiveness of mounted archery tactics demonstrated by Cimmerian forces encouraged military developments among sedentary civilizations that had previously relied primarily on infantry formations and siege warfare. Assyrian military reforms during the 7th century BC incorporated cavalry units equipped with composite bows and trained in tactics derived from contact with Cimmerian forces. Similarly, Greek military development during the Archaic period shows evidence of experimentation with cavalry formations and archery techniques that reflect awareness of nomadic tactical advantages. Persian military organization under the Achaemenid Empire incorporated numerous elements derived from earlier steppe warfare traditions, including the extensive use of mounted archers, the integration of nomadic auxiliary forces, and tactical doctrines that emphasize mobility and flexibility over rigid formation fighting. The famous Persian immortals, while primarily infantry, were supported by cavalry units that employed weapons and tactics clearly influenced by Cimmerian and other nomadic military traditions. Archaeological evidence from Persian sites includes weapons and equipment that show direct continuities with earlier steppe designs, indicating sustained cultural transmission of military technologies across centuries of political change. The technological innovations pioneered by Cimmerian military culture had lasting impact on metallurgical development throughout Eurasia. The sophisticated ironworking techniques required for effective composite bow construction, pattern-welded sword blades, and specialized arrowheads spread through trade networks and cultural contacts to influence metalworking traditions from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Archaeological analysis of iron artifacts from diverse cultural contexts reveals technical approaches and design elements that can be traced to innovations first developed within nomadic military cultures. The psychological warfare aspects of Cimmerian military operations created effects that extended far beyond immediate tactical advantages. The reputation for ferocity and military effectiveness that Cimmerian forces developed through their campaigns against major civilizations created terror effects that often preceded their actual arrival in contested territories. Contemporary sources describe mass population movements and economic disruption triggered by rumours of approaching Cimmerian forces, indicating that their military reputation had become a strategic weapon in itself. Intelligence gathering and reconnaissance capabilities among Cimmerian forces enabled tactical advantages that compensated for their numerical disadvantages relative to the major empires they confronted. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian military leaders maintained extensive networks of informants and scouts who provided advance warning of enemy movements and detailed intelligence about terrain features, resource locations, and political developments. This intelligence capability enabled Cimmerian forces to achieve strategic surprise and concentrate their attacks against vulnerable targets while avoiding unfavourable tactical situations. The adaptation of Cimmerian military techniques to different geographic environments demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility and cultural learning capacity. Archaeological evidence from their campaigns in Anatolia reveals modifications to traditional steppe warfare methods that incorporated lessons learned from fighting in mountainous terrain, forested regions, and urban environments. These adaptations included the development of dismounted combat techniques, siege warfare capabilities, and alliance strategies that enabled effective operations in environments very different from their original steppe homeland. The sophisticated military machine that had devastated Phrygian civilization and challenged Lydian power inevitably encountered the expanding network of Greek colonial settlements along the Black Sea coast. These encounters between Cimmerian warbands and Greek colonists created a complex dynamic that would profoundly influence both nomadic military tactics and Hellenic expansion strategies throughout the 7th century BC. Archaeological evidence from colonial sites reveals patterns of destruction, abandonment, and defensive adaptation that document the immediate impact of Cimmerian pressure on Greek settlement activities, while literary sources preserve memories of conflicts that shaped Greek perceptions of northern barbarians for centuries to come. Greek colonization of the Black Sea region had begun during the 8th century BC as population pressures and economic opportunities drove settlers from mainland Greek cities to establish new communities along the Pontic coastline. These early colonies, including Sinope, Trapezus, and Tanais, represented strategic footholds that provided access to grain supplies, raw materials, and trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with the vast resources of the Eurasian steppes. The colonial settlements typically occupied defensible coastal positions, with natural harbours that facilitated maritime communications while providing some protection against land-based attacks from inland populations. The initial encounters between Cimmerian forces and Greek colonial settlements occurred during the late 8th century BC, as nomadic pressure from Scythian expansion forced Cimmerian groups to seek new territories and resources beyond their traditional steppe homeland. Archaeological excavations at Sinope reveal destruction layers dating to approximately 720 BC, containing arrowheads of distinctly Cimmerian manufacture alongside burned storage facilities and defensive structures. The systematic nature of this destruction suggests coordinated attacks rather than opportunistic raids, indicating that Cimmerian military leaders recognized the strategic and economic value of Greek colonial positions. The impact of Cimmerian raids on Greek colonial development extended far beyond immediate physical destruction to influence fundamental aspects of settlement planning and defensive architecture. Excavations at Chersonesus demonstrate significant modifications to urban layout during the early 7th century BC, with the construction of massive stone fortifications that incorporated lessons learned from Cimmerian siege techniques. These defensive works featured multiple concentric walls, protected gates with complex approach routes, and elevated positions for archers that reflected detailed understanding of nomadic assault methods. The investment required for such extensive fortifications indicates that Greek colonists considered Cimmerian military pressure a persistent and serious threat to their survival. Cimmerian military tactics proved particularly effective against Greek colonial settlements due to the inherent vulnerabilities of isolated communities dependent on maritime supply lines and agricultural production in hostile territory. The mobility advantages that characterized nomadic warfare enabled Cimmerian forces to strike coastal settlements during periods when the relief expeditions from mainland Greek cities could not arrive in time to provide effective assistance. Archaeological evidence from abandoned colonial sites shows patterns of hasty evacuation, with valuable goods buried in caches that were never recovered, suggesting that many settlements were abandoned permanently after Cimmerian attacks. The economic disruption caused by persistent Cimmerian pressure fundamentally altered Greek colonial strategies throughout the Black Sea region. Traditional colonial models had emphasized agricultural development and local resource exploitation, but the constant threat of nomadic raids forced Greek settlers to concentrate on more defensible coastal positions while abandoning inland settlements that provided access to fertile agricultural zones. Archaeological surveys in the hinterlands of major colonial sites reveal numerous abandoned farmsteads and rural settlements dating to this period, indicating systematic withdrawal from exposed positions to more secure coastal enclaves. The Siege of Sardis in 652 BC represents the most significant direct confrontation between Cimmerian forces and Greek military units, as Lydian king Gyges had recruited substantial numbers of Greek mercenaries to strengthen his defensive capabilities against nomadic pressure. Contemporary sources, including fragments preserved by later historians, describe a complex siege operation that lasted several months and involved sophisticated coordination between Cimmerian cavalry units and allied forces from various Anatolian populations opposed to Lydian expansion. The presence of Greek mercenaries in Lydian service created unique tactical challenges for Cimmerian commanders, who faced opponents familiar with both traditional Greek hoplite warfare and the nomadic tactics they had observed during previous colonial conflicts. Archaeological evidence from the Sardis siege reveals the intensity and technical sophistication of Cimmerian assault methods when applied to major urban centres. Excavations in the lower city area have uncovered extensive destruction layers containing thousands of arrowheads, evidence of systematic fire damage, and the remains of siege equipment including scaling ladders and protective mantlets constructed from local materials. The distribution pattern of military artifacts suggests that Cimmerian forces employed coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, utilising their superior mobility to prevent effective concentration of defensive forces at threatened points. Greek mercenary units in Lydian service faced tactical challenges that required significant adaptations to traditional hoplite fighting methods. The heavy infantry formations that dominated Greek military thinking proved vulnerable to Cimmerian mounted archery, forcing mercenary commanders to develop new tactical approaches that incorporated lessons learned from nomadic warfare. Archaeological evidence from weapon caches buried during the siege includes modified Greek spears with reinforced points designed to penetrate nomadic armour, as well as captured Cimmerian arrows that were apparently studied for intelligence purposes regarding enemy capabilities and tactical methods. The psychological impact of the Sardis siege on Greek military thinking extended far beyond the immediate tactical lessons learned by mercenary survivors. Reports from participants in the siege, transmitted through oral traditions and eventually recorded by later historians, described Cimmerian military capabilities in terms that emphasized their superior horsemanship, archery skills, and tactical coordination. These accounts contributed to Greek perceptions of northern barbarians as formidable military opponents whose capabilities exceeded those of traditional enemies encountered in inter-Greek conflicts or colonial expansion activities. The death of King Gidius during the final assault on Sardis marked a turning point in Lydian-Cimmerian relations, while providing Greek observers with detailed information about nomadic siege warfare techniques. Contemporary accounts describe systematic breaches of the city's defensive walls through coordinated attacks that combined archery suppression with direct assault by dismounted warriors equipped with scaling equipment and siege tools. The successful capture of such a heavily fortified position demonstrated that Cimmerian military capabilities had evolved beyond simple raiding to encompass sophisticated siege warfare techniques adapted from contact with various sedentary civilizations. Greek literary sources from the classical period preserve complex and often contradictory portrayals of Cimmerian peoples that reflect both historical memories of actual conflicts and mythological elaborations developed over centuries of oral transmission. Herodotus provides the most systematic historical account of Cimmerian activities, though his narrative combines reliable information derived from Persian and Scythian sources with legendary materials that served literary rather than historical purposes. His description of Cimmerian origins and migration patterns generally corresponds to archaeological evidence, but his accounts of specific battles and political arrangements require careful analysis to separate factual content from narrative embellishment. The distinction between historical and mythological Cimmerians in Greek literature presents ongoing scholarly challenges, as later classical authors often conflated actual nomadic peoples with legendary figures from earlier literary traditions. Homer's references to Cimmerians in the Odyssey clearly describe mythical peoples dwelling at the edges of the world rather than historical populations, but these poetic descriptions influenced later Greek perceptions of northern barbarians and contributed to literary traditions that obscured factual knowledge about actual Cimmerian society and culture. Archaeological evidence provides the most reliable basis for understanding historical Cimmerian activities, though literary sources remain valuable for documenting Greek responses to nomadic military pressure. The influence of Cimmerian military pressure on Greek colonial expansion strategies created lasting changes in Hellenic settlement patterns throughout the Black Sea region and beyond. The demonstrated vulnerability of isolated colonial positions to nomadic attack encouraged Greek cities to establish larger, more heavily fortified settlements capable of withstanding extended sieges, rather than dispersed networks of smaller agricultural communities. Archaeological evidence from later colonial sites shows systematic incorporation of defensive features designed specifically to counter nomadic assault methods, including elevated citadels, multiple defensive perimeters, and protected water sources that could sustain populations during prolonged blockades. The acceleration of westward Greek colonization during the 7th century BC reflects direct responses to Cimmerian pressure in traditional eastern expansion areas. As Black Sea colonial opportunities became increasingly dangerous due to nomadic military activities, Greek cities redirected their expansion efforts towards Sicily, southern Italy, and the western Mediterranean regions, where indigenous populations posed less sophisticated military challenges. Archaeological evidence from Western colonial sites dating to this period shows rapid expansion of Greek settlement activities that corresponds chronologically with the peak period of Cimmerian pressure in Anatolia and the Black Sea region. The technological exchange resulting from Greek-Cimmerian military contact produced innovations that influenced warfare throughout the Mediterranean world. Greek military equipment from the 7th century BC shows clear influences from nomadic weapons technology, particularly in arrowhead design, cavalry equipment, and siege warfare techniques. Conversely, Cimmerian forces acquired knowledge of Greek metallurgical methods, fortification design, and naval warfare capabilities that enhanced their operational effectiveness against other sedentary civilizations. Archaeological evidence from both Greek and nomadic sites documents this technological transfer through the appearance of hybrid weapon designs and modified tactical equipment. The diplomatic relationships that developed between certain Greek cities and Cimmerian leaders during periods of reduced military tension reveal the pragmatic flexibility that characterized both cultures' approach to international relations. Inscriptional evidence from later periods preserves references to treaties and commercial agreements between Greek colonies and nomadic peoples, though the specific identification of these groups as Cimmerians remains problematic due to the generic use of barbarian ethnonyms in Greek diplomatic terminology. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Greek colonial sites maintained trade relationships with nomadic populations even during periods of military conflict, indicating complex political arrangements that transcended simple hostility. The impact of Cimmerian pressure on Greek military development contributed to tactical innovations that would influence Hellenic warfare for centuries. The demonstrated effectiveness of mounted archery against traditional hoplite formations encouraged experimentation with cavalry units and light infantry forces capable of operating effectively against mobile opponents. Archaeological evidence from Greek sites dating to the late 7th century BC includes weapons and equipment designed for cavalry warfare, representing significant departures from traditional heavy infantry emphasis that characterized earlier Greek military culture. The economic consequences of disrupted Black Sea trade due to Cimmerian activities forced Greek cities to develop alternative commercial networks and resource acquisition strategies. The interruption of grain supplies from Pontic agricultural regions created food security challenges that encouraged agricultural intensification in mainland Greek territories and the development of alternative supply sources in Egypt and the Western Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from Greek storage facilities and harbour installations shows modifications designed to accommodate changing trade patterns and supply requirements during this period of commercial disruption. The influence of Cimmerian military reputation on Greek political development contributed to the emergence of tyrannical regimes in several cities during the 7th century BC. The external military pressure created conditions that favoured strong individual leadership capable of organising effective defensive measures and coordinating military responses to nomadic threats. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Greek tyrants invested heavily in fortification projects and military equipment that reflected awareness of nomadic warfare capabilities and the need for enhanced defensive preparations. The cultural exchange between Greek colonists and Cimmerian populations produced artistic and technological innovations that spread throughout the ancient world. Greek artistic traditions began incorporating motifs and techniques derived from steppe cultures, particularly in metalwork and decorative arts. Archaeological evidence from Greek colonial sites includes artifacts that combine Hellenic artistic traditions with nomadic design elements, creating hybrid styles that influenced artistic development throughout the Mediterranean region. Similarly, Cimmerian metalwork from this period shows influences from Greek technical methods and decorative traditions, indicating sustained cultural contact despite ongoing military conflicts. The relentless cycle of warfare that had sustained Cimmerian military dominance across Anatolia and the Near East for nearly a century began to exact an increasingly devastating toll on the social fabric and demographic foundations of nomadic society itself. The very success of Cimmerian military campaigns created internal contradictions that gradually undermined the political cohesion and strategic coordination necessary for maintaining effective resistance against increasingly sophisticated enemy responses. Archaeological evidence from the late 7th century BC reveals clear indicators of social fragmentation, including the proliferation of smaller burial complexes, reduced standardization in weapons production, and the abandonment of traditional territorial markers that had previously defined Cimmerian tribal boundaries. The continuous warfare that had enabled Cimmerian expansion and resource acquisition began producing demographic pressures that threatened the long-term viability of nomadic society. Military campaigns against major urban centres required substantial manpower commitments that drew warriors away from essential pastoral activities, disrupting seasonal migration patterns and reducing the labour force available for animal husbandry. Archaeological analysis of animal bone assemblages from Cimmerian sites dating to this period shows evidence of declining herd sizes and reduced breeding success, indicating that military priorities were compromising the economic foundations of traditional nomadic life. The acquisition of substantial wealth through successful raids and tribute arrangements created new forms of social stratification that challenged traditional kinship-based authority structures. Elite warriors accumulated personal followings based on military success rather than tribal affiliation, leading to the emergence of competing power centres that fragmented unified command structures. Burial evidence from this period reveals increasing disparities in grave goods distribution, with some individuals interred with unprecedented quantities of gold, silver, and imported luxury items, while others received minimal burial treatment despite clear evidence of warrior status. These growing inequalities created internal tensions that weakened the solidarity necessary for coordinated military operations. The geographical dispersion of Cimmerian forces across multiple theatres of operation, from the Black Sea to Mesopotamia, created communication and coordination challenges that proved increasingly difficult to manage through traditional nomadic political institutions. Different Cimmerian groups operating in Anatolia, the Caucasus, and various tributary relationships with sedentary kingdoms began developing distinct interests and strategic priorities that conflicted with broader tribal objectives. Archaeological evidence suggests that weapon standardization, which had previously enabled effective coordination between different military units, began breaking down as regional groups adapted their equipment to local conditions and tactical requirements. The pressure of fighting simultaneous campaigns against multiple sophisticated enemies gradually exhausted the military resources and strategic reserves that had enabled earlier Cimmerian successes. The Assyrian Empire, despite suffering significant territorial losses and administrative disruption from nomadic raids, maintained substantial military capabilities and demonstrated increasing effectiveness in countering Cimmerian tactical advantages. Assyrian military reforms during the mid-7th century BC incorporated lessons learned from fighting nomadic opponents, including the development of specialized cavalry units, improved archery equipment, and tactical doctrines designed specifically to counter mobile warfare methods. The emergence of effective counter-strategies among sedentary civilizations represented perhaps the most significant challenge to continued Cimmerian military dominance. The initial shock effect that had enabled small nomadic forces to overwhelm much larger armies began diminishing as enemy commanders developed tactical approaches specifically designed to neutralize nomadic advantages. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites dating to the late 7th century BC shows increasing quantities of specialized anti-cavalry weapons, including long spears designed for infantry formations and caltrops intended to disable enemy horses. These innovations indicated systematic military adaptation rather than ad hoc responses to nomadic pressure. The rise of Aliats to the Lydian throne around 610 BC marked the beginning of sustained and increasingly successful resistance to Cimmerian military pressure in western Anatolia. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied primarily on defensive strategies and diplomatic arrangements, Aliates implemented aggressive counter-campaign policies designed to systematically eliminate Cimmerian strongholds and disrupt their operational bases. Archaeological evidence from his reign includes extensive fortification projects that incorporated advanced engineering techniques and the establishment of forward operating bases in previously contested territories. Aliat's military innovations reflected sophisticated understanding of nomadic warfare methods and systematic exploitation of their inherent vulnerabilities. Rather than attempting to match Cimmerian mobility through cavalry development, Lydian forces under his command concentrated on controlling strategic resources and geographical choke points that nomadic operations required for sustained effectiveness. Archaeological excavations at sites along major river crossings and mountain passes reveal fortified positions dating to this period, equipped with substantial garrisons and supply depots capable of supporting extended operations against mobile opponents. The systematic nature of Aliat's counter-campaigns involved coordinated attacks against Cimmerian seasonal camps, grazing areas and supply bases that targeted the logistical foundations of nomadic military operations rather than seeking decisive battlefield confrontations. Intelligence networks developed by Lydian forces provided detailed information about Cimmerian movement patterns and resource requirements, enabling preemptive strikes against vulnerable targets. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Cimmerian campsites shows evidence of systematic destruction, including burned storage facilities, scattered equipment, and hastily buried valuables that were never recovered. The effectiveness of Lydian counter-operations stemmed partly from Aliat's ability to coordinate his military activities with other regional powers facing similar nomadic pressures. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in Assyrian archives suggests formal alliance arrangements between Lydia and various Anatolian kingdoms that enabled coordinated campaigns and shared intelligence regarding Cimmerian activities. These cooperative relationships created strategic challenges for Cimmerian forces, who found themselves facing simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, while their traditional tactics of exploiting political divisions among sedentary populations became increasingly ineffective. The technological advantages that had previously favoured Cimmerian military operations began eroding as sedentary civilizations developed countermeasures and acquired similar capabilities through various forms of military exchange. Lydian forces under Aliat demonstrated proficiency with composite bows, mounted archery techniques, and cavalry tactics that had formerly been exclusive to nomadic peoples. Archaeological evidence from Lydian military sites includes weapons and equipment that show clear influences from steppe traditions, indicating systematic adoption of nomadic military technologies by their sedentary opponents. The gradual shift from offensive to defensive operations forced fundamental changes in Cimmerian military organization and tactical approaches. The mobile warfare methods that had enabled spectacular successes against unprepared enemies proved less effective when facing opponents who had adapted their strategies specifically to counter nomadic advantages. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian forces began constructing more permanent fortified positions during this period, representing significant departures from traditional nomadic practices that emphasized mobility over territorial control. The establishment of permanent or semi-permanent bases created new vulnerabilities that Lydian and other enemy forces systematically exploited. Fixed positions required substantial garrison forces that reduced the manpower available for mobile operations, while the need to defend specific locations limited tactical flexibility and enabled enemy forces to concentrate their attacks against known targets. Archaeological excavations at former Cimmerian strongholds reveal evidence of systematic siege operations, including approach trenches, artillery positions, and evidence of sustained bombardment that indicates sophisticated siege warfare capabilities among their opponents. The assimilation processes that began affecting Cimmerian populations during the late 7th century BC reflected both military pressures and economic opportunities that encouraged integration with sedentary societies. Archaeological evidence from sites in Anatolia and the Caucasus region shows gradual transitions from nomadic to sedentary material culture, with traditional Cimmerian artifacts appearing alongside locally produced pottery agricultural tools and architectural remains indicating permanent settlement. These changes suggest that substantial numbers of Cimmerian people abandoned traditional pastoral lifestyles in favour of agricultural or urban occupations. The adoption of sedentary lifestyles created fundamental changes in social organisation, economic activities, and cultural practices that gradually eroded traditional Cimmerian identity markers. Archaeological analysis of settlement sites shows evidence of agricultural activities, craft specialisation, and architectural developments that required long-term territorial commitment incompatible with nomadic mobility. Pottery assemblages from these sites display hybrid characteristics combining traditional Cimmerian decorative motifs with local technical traditions, indicating cultural synthesis rather than simple conquest or displacement. Marriage relationships between Cimmerian individuals and members of sedentary populations facilitated cultural integration processes that accelerated the dissolution of distinct ethnic boundaries. Archaeological evidence from burial sites shows increasing numbers of graves containing mixed material culture assemblages that combine nomadic and sedentary traditions, suggesting intermarriage and cultural exchange at the family level. These relationships created kinship networks that transcended traditional ethnic divisions and provided pathways for individual and group assimilation into local populations. The economic incentives for abandoning traditional nomadic lifestyles became increasingly compelling as military opportunities diminished and sedentary occupations offered greater security and prosperity. Archaeological evidence suggests that former Cimmerian warriors found employment as mercenaries in various regional armies, while others established themselves as craftsmen, traders, or agricultural workers in established communities. The specialised skills developed through nomadic life, including horsemanship, metalworking, and military expertise, provided valuable qualifications for integration into sedentary economic systems. The fragmentation of Cimmerian political authority accelerated assimilation processes by eliminating the institutional mechanisms that had previously maintained ethnic cohesion and cultural continuity. Without unified leadership capable of coordinating resistance to external pressures or maintaining traditional practices, individual Cimmerian communities faced choices between continued resistance with diminishing prospects for success, or integration with more powerful neighbours offering security and economic opportunities. Archaeological evidence suggests that most chose integration, though the process occurred gradually over several generations, rather than through sudden abandonment of traditional practices. The linguistic assimilation of Cimmerian populations into local communities represents one of the most significant but poorly documented aspects of this integration process. While archaeological evidence can document changes in material culture and settlement patterns, the gradual adoption of local languages and the abandonment of traditional Cimmerian linguistic practices remains largely invisible in the archaeological record. However, the survival of certain place names and personal names in later periods suggests that linguistic assimilation was incomplete, and that some Cimmerian linguistic elements persisted within local populations. The religious and cultural practices that had maintained Cimmerian identity faced particular challenges during the assimilation process, as traditional nomadic spiritual traditions required specific environmental contexts and social structures that were incompatible with sedentary lifestyles. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites shows gradual abandonment of traditional burial practices, including the construction of kurgan mounds and horse sacrifices in favour of local funeral customs. However, some elements of traditional religious practice appear to have survived through syncretistic combinations with local spiritual traditions. The final dispersal of identifiable Cimmerian populations occurred through complex processes that varied significantly across different geographical regions and political contexts. In some areas, military defeat and political collapse led to rapid scattering of surviving populations, while in others, gradual economic and social integration enabled more systematic absorption into local communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that the latest clearly identifiable Cimmerian material culture assemblages date to approximately 620 BC, though isolated groups may have maintained traditional practices for several additional decades. The absorption of remaining Cimmerian populations into various regional ethnic groups created lasting influences on the cultural development of Anatolian and Caucasian societies. Archaeological evidence from the 6th century BC shows continued presence of artistic motifs, metallurgical techniques, and military equipment designs that derived from Cimmerian traditions, indicating that cultural assimilation preserves certain elements of nomadic heritage within sedentary contexts. These influences contributed to the cultural diversity that characterized later Anatolian civilizations and provided foundations for subsequent military and artistic developments. The demographic impact of Cimmerian integration varied considerably across different regions, with some areas experiencing substantial population increases from nomadic settlement, while others saw minimal direct effects. Archaeological surveys in areas of known Cimmerian activity reveal varying patterns of site abandonment and establishment that reflect the complex nature of population movements during this period. Some regions show evidence of new settlement establishment that corresponds chronologically with Cimmerian presence, while others display continuity in existing settlement patterns, with gradual material culture changes indicating cultural influence rather than demographic replacement. The military legacy of Cimmerian warfare continued to influence tactical development throughout the ancient world long after the disappearance of identifiable Cimmerian political entities. The cavalry tactics, archery techniques, and siege warfare methods developed during their campaigns provided models that subsequent military forces adapted to their own strategic requirements. Archaeological evidence from various ancient armies shows continued use of weapons and equipment designs that originated in Cimmerian military culture, demonstrating the lasting impact of their tactical innovations on military development across Eurasia. The physical remains left behind by Cimmerian populations present one of the most challenging puzzles in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, requiring sophisticated analytical techniques to distinguish genuinely Cimmerian materials from the broader spectrum of nomadic cultures that swept across the Eurasian steppes during the Iron Age. The methodological difficulties inherent in identifying specifically Cimmerian archaeological signatures have sparked decades of scholarly debate regarding the ethnic attribution of excavated materials, the geographic extent of Cimmerian territorial control, and the duration of their presence in various regions across Anatolia and the Black Sea littoral. The Chernogorovka culture complex, centered in the Dnieper Bend region of modern Ukraine, represents the most substantial body of archaeological evidence directly attributable to Proto-Cimmerian populations. Excavations conducted by Soviet and later Ukrainian archaeologists at sites including Zhabotin, Subotov, and Pereshepina have revealed stratified deposits spanning the crucial transition period from the Late Bronze Age through the Early Iron Age. These sites contain distinctive artifact assemblages that combine traditional steppe burial practices with technological innovations in metallurgy and horse equipment that would later characterize classical period descriptions of Cimmerian military culture. The type site at Chernogorovka itself, excavated extensively during the 1950s and 1960s under the direction of A.I. Terenozhkin, yielded over 200 individual burials arranged in both traditional Kurgan mounds and flat-grave cemeteries that demonstrate evolving social hierarchies within early Cimmerian society. The primary burial in Kurgan, 524, contained an adult male interred with a complete iron sword featuring the distinctive crossguard design later associated with Cimmerian warriors, bronze horse bits with elaborate zoomorphic decorations, and over 150 bronze arrowheads displaying the characteristic three-bladed, socketed construction that would become standard throughout the steppe region. Metallurgical analysis of iron artifacts from Chernogorovka sites reveals sophisticated understanding of carburization techniques that produced weapons with hardened cutting edges and flexible cores optimized for mounted combat applications. Spectrographic analysis conducted on sword blades from multiple burial contexts indicates consistent iron sources and manufacturing techniques, suggesting centralized production facilities capable of equipping substantial military forces with standardized equipment. The technical quality of these early iron weapons exceeds contemporary examples from most sedentary civilizations, demonstrating that nomadic smiths had achieved metallurgical capabilities that provided significant tactical advantages in warfare. The horse equipment recovered from Chernogorovka sites provides crucial evidence for reconstructing Cimmerian cavalry capabilities and military organization. Bronze bits from elite burials feature complex leverage mechanisms with jointed mouthpieces designed to provide maximum control during rapid maneuvers, while decorative elements incorporate stylized animal motifs that reflect developing artistic traditions distinct from earlier steppe cultures. Wear patterns on bit components indicate intensive use by trained cavalry mounts, supporting textual evidence for the superior horsemanship that characterized Cimmerian military effectiveness. Ceramic assemblages from Chernogorovka contexts display distinctive decorative schemes that combine geometric patterns with stylized representations of horses, weapons, and human figures engaged in combat activities. The standardization of pottery forms and decorative motifs across multiple sites suggests shared cultural traditions and possibly centralized production systems that maintained artistic continuity across the broader Cimmerian territorial range. Petrographic analysis of ceramic fabrics indicates local clay sources but consistent manufacturing techniques, supporting theories of population mobility combined with technological standardization. The Novocherkassk treasure, discovered in 1939 near Rostov-on-Don, represents one of the most spectacular archaeological finds associated with Cimmerian material culture. The hoard contained over 30 individual objects including gold and silver vessels, bronze cauldrons, iron weapons and horse gear, manufactured using techniques consistent with 7th century BC Cimmerian workshops. The famous gold stag plaque from this assemblage displays artistic motifs that would later appear throughout the Scythian world, suggesting either cultural continuity between Cimmerian and Scythian populations, or the transmission of artistic traditions through conquest and assimilation processes. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from Novocherkassk contexts provides crucial chronological anchors for understanding the transition from Cimmerian to Scythian cultural dominance in the North Pontic region. Calibrated dates ranging from 720 to 650 BC correspond precisely with historical accounts of Scythian expansion and Cimmerian displacement preserved in Assyrian cuneiform sources and later Greek historical traditions. The correspondence between archaeological and textual chronologies strengthens arguments for the historical reliability of ancient sources regarding nomadic population movements during the early Iron Age. Archaeological investigations at Anatolian sites have revealed evidence for Cimmerian presence that complements textual sources describing their military campaigns against established kingdoms in the region. Excavations at Sardis, the Lydian capital, have uncovered destruction layers containing large quantities of three-bladed arrowheads characteristic of steppe nomadic warfare, along with evidence of systematic fire damage to administrative and residential districts that corresponds with historical accounts of Cimmerian siege operations during the mid-7th century BC. The lower city area at Sardis shows particularly clear evidence of violent destruction, with collapsed mud brick walls containing embedded arrowheads and scattered bronze weapons that indicate fierce fighting in residential neighbourhoods. The distribution pattern of military artifacts suggests systematic house-to-house combat rather than simple raiding, supporting textual evidence that Cimmerian forces had developed sophisticated urban warfare capabilities adapted from their traditional nomadic tactics. Stratigraphic analysis indicates that the destruction occurred rapidly, with minimal evidence of reconstruction activities before the site was abandoned for several decades. Excavations at Gordion, the former Phrygian capital, have revealed similar destruction evidence dating to approximately 676 BC, with extensive fire damage throughout the citadel area and numerous arrowheads of types consistent with Cimmerian military equipment. The famous Midas Mound burial shows evidence of disturbance during antiquity, with scattered grave goods and damaged wooden furniture that may indicate looting during the Cimmerian assault. However, the preservation of substantial burial assemblages suggests that the destruction was not completely systematic, possibly indicating that Cimmerian forces were primarily interested in eliminating political resistance rather than comprehensive urban destruction. The methodological challenges involved in distinguishing Cimmerian archaeological materials from those of other steppe cultures reflect fundamental problems in prehistoric archaeology regarding ethnic identification and cultural attribution. The material culture similarities between different nomadic populations, combined with the mobility that characterize steppe societies, create overlapping artifact distributions that resist simple ethnic classification. Archaeological assemblages from the North Pontic region show gradual transitions rather than sharp cultural breaks, indicating complex processes of cultural interaction and demographic mixing that complicate efforts to identify specific ethnic groups. Comparative analysis of burial practices across the steppe region reveals both continuities and innovations that may reflect Cimmerian cultural contributions to broader nomadic traditions. The increased frequency of horse sacrifices in 8th and 7th century BC contexts corresponds chronologically with the period of Cimmerian political prominence, suggesting possible ritual innovations that spread through cultural contact and military conquest. However, similar practices appear in contemporary Central Asian contexts, indicating that ritual developments may have reflected broader cultural trends rather than specifically Cimmerian innovations. Weapon typology provides one of the most reliable methods for identifying Cimmerian archaeological signatures, as the distinctive sword and arrowhead designs associated with their military culture show consistent characteristics across widely separated geographic contexts. The Achanica sword type, with its characteristic straight blade and distinctive crossguard design, appears in archaeological contexts from the North Pontic steppes to Anatolia and the Caucasus region during the 7th century BC. Metallurgical analysis reveals consistent manufacturing techniques and design specifications that suggest either centralized production or systematic transmission of technical knowledge across Cimmerian territorial ranges. Arrowhead typology offers particularly precise chronological and cultural markers, as the three-bladed socketed design characteristic of Cimmerian archery equipment shows distinctive manufacturing details that differentiate it from similar types produced by other steppe cultures. Statistical analysis of arrowhead dimensions from multiple archaeological contexts reveals standardized proportions that suggest quality control mechanisms and possibly centralized production facilities. The geographic distribution of these standardized types corresponds closely with historical accounts of Cimmerian military activities, providing archaeological confirmation of textual sources. The integration of archaeological and textual evidence requires careful consideration of the limitations and biases inherent in both types of sources. Ancient historical accounts, primarily preserved in Assyrian cuneiform archives and later Greek literary sources, reflect the perspectives of sedentary civilizations confronting nomadic military pressure and may not accurately represent Cimmerian society and culture from internal viewpoints. Archaeological evidence provides direct access to material culture, but cannot illuminate political structures, religious beliefs, or social relationships that left no physical traces. Assyrian royal inscriptions and administrative documents provide the most contemporary and detailed accounts of Cimmerian military activities, though their focus on imperial concerns limits their utility for understanding nomadic society and culture. The Annals of Sargon II describe encounters with Cimmerian forces during campaigns in the Caucasus region, providing specific details about Cimmerian military tactics, equipment, and political organisation that can be compared with archaeological evidence from contemporary sites. However, the propagandistic nature of royal inscriptions requires careful analysis to separate factual information from rhetorical embellishment designed to glorify royal achievements. Administrative correspondence from Assyrian provincial archives offers more objective information about Cimmerian activities, as these documents were intended for internal governmental use rather than public propaganda. Letters from frontier governors describe Cimmerian raid patterns, seasonal movement cycles, and diplomatic negotiations that provide insights into nomadic political structures and strategic objectives. The geographic specificity of these reports enables correlation with archaeological evidence from sites mentioned in the correspondence, strengthening arguments for the historical accuracy of administrative sources. Greek historical sources, primarily Herodotus and later classical authors, preserve traditions regarding Cimmerian origins and activities that derive from multiple sources, including Persian imperial archives, Scythian oral traditions, and Greek colonial experiences in the Black Sea region. The temporal distance between the events described and their recording in written sources creates obvious reliability concerns, but the general consistency between Greek accounts and contemporary Assyrian sources suggests that substantial factual content was preserved through oral transmission processes. Herodotus's account of Scythian-Cimmerian conflicts provides detailed information about population movements and territorial boundaries that can be tested against archaeological evidence from the North Pontic region. His description of Cimmerian burial practices, political organisation, and material culture shows remarkable correspondence with archaeological findings from sites like Chernogorovka and Novocherkassk, suggesting access to reliable informants with direct knowledge of nomadic traditions. However, his tendency to incorporate mythological elements and moral lessons requires careful source criticism to identify historically accurate information. The linguistic evidence for Cimmerian ethnic identity presents particular challenges due to the absence of written records in the Cimmerian language and the limited survival of Cimmerian linguistic elements in later sources. Comparative linguistic analysis suggests connections to both Thracian and Iranian language families, but the evidence remains insufficient for definitive classification. Place names in the North Pontic region preserve possible Cimmerian linguistic elements, though distinguishing these from later Scythian or other nomadic contributions requires sophisticated philological analysis that remains controversial among specialists. Modern scholarly debates regarding Cimmerian ethnicity reflect broader theoretical issues in prehistoric archaeology and ancient history concerning the relationship between material culture and ethnic identity. Some scholars argue for a broad definition of Cimmerian identity that encompasses various nomadic groups sharing similar material culture and lifestyle patterns, while others advocate for more restrictive definitions based on specific archaeological signatures and historical documentation. These definitional disagreements influence interpretations of archaeological evidence and assessments of Cimmerian historical significance. The migration patterns attributed to Cimmerian populations have generated extensive scholarly discussion regarding the mechanisms and chronology of nomadic population movements during the early Iron Age. Archaeological evidence supports general southward and westward movement from the North Pontic steppes toward Anatolia and the Caucasus, but the specific routes, timing, and demographic scale of these movements remain contentious. Some scholars argue for massive population displacements involving entire tribal confederations, while others propose more limited movements of military elites who established political control over existing populations. The historical impact of Cimmerian activities continues to generate scholarly debate regarding their significance in broader patterns of ancient Near Eastern political and cultural development. Traditional interpretations emphasize the destructive effects of nomadic invasions on established civilizations, citing the destruction of Phrygian power and the disruption of regional trade networks as evidence of Cimmerian historical importance. More recent scholarship has questioned this interpretation, arguing that Cimmerian activities represented responses to existing political instabilities rather than primary causes of civilizational collapse. Archaeological evidence from destruction layers at sites like Sardis and Gordian provides clear documentation of violent conflict during the 7th century BC, but determining the specific role of Cimmerian forces in these events requires careful analysis of stratigraphic contexts and artifact assemblages. The presence of Cimmerian-type arrowheads in destruction layers indicates their participation in military activities, but does not necessarily prove that they were the primary agents of destruction. Local political conflicts and other military forces may have contributed to urban destruction that has been attributed primarily to Cimmerian activities. The technological innovations associated with Cimmerian material culture had lasting influence on military development throughout Eurasia, though assessing their specific contributions requires distinguishing Cimmerian innovations from parallel developments in other nomadic cultures. The sophisticated ironworking techniques evident in Cimmerian weapons influenced metallurgical traditions throughout the steppe region and beyond, while their cavalry equipment designs provided models that were adopted by sedentary civilizations seeking to develop effective mounted warfare capabilities. The artistic traditions preserved in Cimmerian metalwork and decorative objects contributed to the development of animal-style art that would later characterize Scythian and other nomadic cultures throughout the Eurasian steppes. The stylized animal motifs and geometric patterns found on objects from sites like Novotcherkassk show clear continuities with later artistic traditions, suggesting either direct cultural transmission or the establishment of artistic conventions that influence subsequent cultural development. However, determining the specific Cimmerian contribution to these artistic traditions requires careful analysis of chronological sequences and cultural contexts that remain incompletely understood. The demographic legacy of Cimmerian populations in regions where they established temporary or permanent settlements continues to interest scholars studying ancient population genetics and ethnic formation processes. While direct genetic evidence remains limited due to the poor preservation of organic materials in many archaeological contexts, comparative analysis of material culture suggests that Cimmerian groups contributed to the ethnic composition of various Anatolian and Caucasian populations through intermarriage and cultural assimilation processes that occurred over several centuries. The gradual disappearance of identifiable Cimmerian political entities from the historical record during the early 6th century BC marked not the end of their influence, but rather the beginning of a remarkable transformation that would see these once feared nomadic warriors evolve from historical actors into legendary figures whose reputation would echo through millennia of subsequent literature, scholarship, and popular imagination. The process by which historical Cimmerians became mythologized began almost immediately after their political fragmentation, as Greek authors sought to make sense of the devastating conflicts that had reshaped the ancient Near Eastern world during the 7th century BC. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century BC, already demonstrates the complex relationship between historical memory and legendary elaboration that would characterize all subsequent treatments of Cimmerian peoples. His account in the Histories presents Cimmerians as both concrete historical actors whose military campaigns could be dated and located with reasonable precision, and as representatives of primordial forces from the mysterious northern regions beyond the boundaries of civilized knowledge. This dual characterization established a template that later authors would follow, treating Cimmerians simultaneously as documented historical peoples and as symbols of barbaric power emanating from the world's dark peripheries. The geographic associations that developed around Cimmerian peoples in Greek literature contributed significantly to their mythologization. Homer's references in the Odyssey to Cimmerians dwelling in perpetual darkness at the edges of the world created poetic imagery that subsequent authors found irresistible, even when dealing with historically documented Cimmerian activities. The conflation of historical Cimmerians with Homeric literary traditions produced composite portraits that combined factual military achievements with supernatural characteristics derived from epic poetry. This literary synthesis proved remarkably durable, influencing European conceptions of northern peoples for over 2 millennia. Roman authors inherited Greek literary traditions regarding Cimmerians, but adapted them to serve different cultural and political purposes within the expanding imperial context. Strabo's geography attempts to reconcile conflicting Greek sources regarding Cimmerian origins and activities, but his systematic approach reveals the extent to which legendary materials had already contaminated historical traditions by the 1st century BC. His careful distinction between historical and mythical Cimmerians acknowledges the problem while simultaneously perpetuating it, as his own account incorporates elements from both categories without clear methodological criteria for distinguishing reliable from unreliable information. The Roman fascination with barbarian peoples as foils for civilized society found perfect expression in Cimmerian legends, which provided examples of primitive military prowess that both threatened and validated imperial expansion. Tacitus and other imperial historians use Cimmerian examples to illustrate the civilizing mission of Roman conquest, portraying nomadic warfare as representing an earlier stage of human development that Roman military discipline and political organization had transcended. This interpretive framework transformed historical Cimmerian military achievements into cautionary tales about the dangers of uncontrolled barbarian power, while simultaneously celebrating Roman superiority over such primitive forces. The transmission of Cimmerian legends through late antique and early medieval sources created additional layers of interpretation that further obscured historical realities. Christian authors found in Cimmerian stories useful examples of divine judgment against pagan civilizations, interpreting nomadic invasions as instruments of providential punishment for moral corruption. This theological framework encouraged the preservation of Cimmerian traditions while transforming their significance from historical documentation to moral instruction, creating narrative structures that emphasize supernatural causation over political and military analysis. Byzantine historical traditions maintained awareness of Cimmerian peoples through their preservation of classical sources, but the geographic displacement of the Eastern Roman Empire from traditional Cimmerian territorial ranges reduced direct cultural memory of nomadic activities in Anatolia and the Black Sea region. The focus of Byzantine attention on contemporary steppe peoples, including various Turkic and Mongolic groups, created comparative frameworks that interpreted historical Cimmerians as predecessors of more recent nomadic threats. This comparative approach preserved some accurate information about nomadic warfare methods, while embedding it within an anachronistic political and cultural contexts. Medieval European knowledge of Cimmerian peoples derived primarily from classical literary sources, rather than direct historical investigation, creating opportunities for creative elaboration that reflected contemporary concerns rather than ancient realities. The crusading period's emphasis on conflicts between Christian and non-Christian peoples provided interpretive frameworks that cast historical Cimmerians as early examples of barbarian threats to civilized society. Chronicle writers incorporated Cimmerian references as historical precedents for contemporary conflicts, using ancient examples to legitimize military campaigns against various nomadic peoples threatening European frontiers, the Renaissance revival of classical learning brought renewed scholarly attention to ancient sources regarding Cimmerian peoples, but humanist approaches to historical interpretation often prioritize literary elegance over factual accuracy. The development of systematic philological methods enabled more sophisticated analysis of ancient texts, but the absence of archaeological evidence meant that textual criticism remained the primary tool for understanding Cimmerian history. This methodological limitation encouraged continued reliance on literary sources that had already incorporated substantial legendary materials, perpetuating earlier confusions between historical and mythological elements. The emergence of comparative historical methods during the Enlightenment created new possibilities for understanding Cimmerian peoples within broader patterns of nomadic migration and cultural interaction. Edward Gibbon's treatment of barbarian invasions in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire established analytical frameworks that interpreted Cimmerian activities as early examples of recurring historical patterns involving nomadic pressure on sedentary civilizations. This comparative approach provided valuable insights into the structural factors underlying nomadic sedentary conflicts, while sometimes obscuring the specific historical circumstances that shaped Cimmerian activities. The development of scientific archaeology during the 19th century promised to resolve long-standing debates about Cimmerian history through systematic excavation and material analysis. Early archaeological investigations in the Black Sea region uncovered substantial evidence for Iron Age nomadic cultures, but the methodological limitations of 19th century excavation techniques and the absence of reliable chronological frameworks made it difficult to distinguish specifically Cimmerian materials from those of other steppe peoples. The tendency to attribute impressive archaeological discoveries to historically documented peoples sometimes led to overconfident identifications that subsequent researchers questioned or abandoned. Russian and Soviet archaeological programs in the North Pontic region during the 20th century produced unprecedented quantities of data regarding Iron Age steppe cultures, including materials that could be plausibly associated with historical Cimmerian populations. The systematic excavation of sites like Chernogorovka and the analysis of burial complexes throughout Ukraine provided concrete evidence for reconstructing nomadic society and culture during the crucial 8th and 7th centuries BC. However, the political context within which this research occurred sometimes encouraged interpretations that emphasized ethnic continuity and territorial claims rather than objective historical analysis. The most dramatic transformation of Cimmerian historical memory occurred through their adoption by modern popular culture, beginning with Robert E. Howard's creation of Conan the Cimmerian during the 1930s. Howard's fictional Cimmeria bore virtually no resemblance to historical Cimmerian society, drawing instead on romantic conceptions of primitive barbarian nobility that reflected contemporary American cultural concerns rather than ancient realities. The enormous popularity of Howard's stories created a version of Cimmerian identity that completely overshadowed historical knowledge in popular consciousness, establishing character types and narrative patterns that continue to influence fantasy literature and other media. Howard's Cimmeria represented a synthesis of various cultural elements drawn from Celtic, Germanic, and other European traditions, rather than any attempt to reconstruct historical nomadic society. The emphasis on individual heroism, primitive virtue, and resistance to civilized decadence reflected distinctly modern concerns about industrial society and cultural authenticity, rather than ancient nomadic values or social structures. This creative transformation demonstrated the remarkable flexibility of historical memory, showing how ancient names and associations could be completely reimagined to serve contemporary cultural purposes. The influence of Howard's fictional Cimmeria on subsequent fantasy literature established narrative conventions that continue to shape popular representations of ancient nomadic peoples. The archetypal barbarian warrior, combining physical prowess with moral integrity and natural wisdom, became a standard character type that appears throughout modern fantasy fiction, gaming, and visual media. These fictional representations often incorporate elements derived from various historical nomadic cultures, but the specific association with Cimmerian peoples reflects Howard's creative legacy rather than historical documentation. Contemporary historical fiction dealing with ancient nomadic peoples faces the challenge of distinguishing between historically plausible reconstructions and popular mythologies that have become embedded in cultural consciousness. Authors attempting to portray historical Cimmerians must navigate between archaeological evidence that remains incomplete and controversial, classical sources that combine factual information with legendary materials, and popular expectations shaped by decades of fantasy literature. This creative challenge reflects broader issues in historical fiction regarding the balance between accuracy and accessibility in representing ancient peoples and cultures. The lasting impact of Cimmerian military innovations on ancient warfare development represents perhaps their most significant historical legacy, extending far beyond the immediate chronological and geographical boundaries of their political activities. The tactical integration of mounted archery with coordinated cavalry maneuvers that characterized Cimmerian military effectiveness provided models that influenced military development throughout Eurasia for centuries after the disappearance of identifiable Cimmerian political entities. Archaeological evidence from diverse cultural contexts reveals weapons designs, tactical equipment, and military practices that can be traced to innovations first developed within Cimmerian military culture. The composite bow technology that enabled Cimmerian archery superiority spread through trade networks and military contacts to influence weapon development from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The sophisticated understanding of materials science and engineering principles required for effective composite bow construction created technical knowledge that was transmitted through craft traditions and military exchanges long after its original cultural context had disappeared. Archaeological analysis of bow fragments from sites throughout the ancient world reveals construction techniques and design principles that derive from innovations first documented in Cimmerian contexts. Cavalry tactics developed by Cimmerian military leaders provided foundational concepts that subsequent nomadic and sedentary armies adapted to their own strategic requirements and cultural contexts. The coordination of mounted archery with close combat cavalry charges created tactical possibilities that required fundamental changes in military training, equipment design, and battlefield organization. The influence of these tactical innovations can be traced through military developments in Persian, Greek, Roman, and various Central Asian armies that incorporated elements derived from original Cimmerian military practices. The metallurgical techniques that produced superior Cimmerian weapons influenced iron-working traditions throughout the ancient world through various forms of technological transfer and cultural exchange. The sophisticated understanding of differential heat treatment, pattern welding, and alloy composition that characterized Cimmerian weapon production created technical standards that subsequent smiths sought to match or exceed. Archaeological evidence from weapon production sites across Eurasia reveals manufacturing techniques and quality control methods that derive from innovations first developed within nomadic military cultures. Horsebreeding programs initiated by Cimmerian peoples to produce mounts optimized for warfare created genetic lineages that influenced equine development throughout the ancient world. The selective breeding techniques that produced horses capable of carrying armoured riders across extended distances while maintaining speed and manoeuvrability required sophisticated understanding of equine genetics and behaviour. The influence of these breeding programs can be traced through archaeological analysis of horse remains from sites throughout Eurasia, revealing morphological characteristics that derive from bloodlines first developed within steppe nomadic cultures. The siege warfare techniques that Cimmerian forces developed through their campaigns against fortified urban centres contributed to military engineering knowledge that influenced subsequent developments in both offensive and defensive technologies. The adaptation of traditional nomadic mobility advantages to the requirements of sustained siege operations created tactical innovations that were studied and adopted by various sedentary armies. Archaeological evidence from fortification sites throughout Anatolia and the Near East reveals defensive modifications that reflect responses to siege techniques first employed by nomadic forces. The intelligence gathering and reconnaissance capabilities that enabled Cimmerian strategic advantages provided organizational models that influenced military development throughout the ancient world. The systematic collection and analysis of information regarding enemy capabilities, terrain features, and political developments required institutional structures that transcended traditional nomadic social organization. The effectiveness of these intelligence systems encouraged their adoption by sedentary armies seeking to improve their strategic planning and tactical coordination capabilities. The integration of different ethnic and cultural groups within Cimmerian military formations created organizational precedents that influenced subsequent developments in military recruitment and command structures. The successful coordination of diverse tribal contingents under unified command required administrative innovations that balanced central authority with respect for traditional autonomy and cultural practices. These organizational solutions provided models that were adapted by various imperial armies seeking to incorporate diverse populations within unified military structures. The diplomatic and political strategies that Cimmerian leaders employed in their interactions with sedentary civilizations contributed to the development of international relations concepts that influenced subsequent political developments throughout the ancient world. The successful negotiation of tribute arrangements, military alliances, and territorial agreements required sophisticated understanding of comparative political systems and cultural differences. The precedents established through these diplomatic activities provided frameworks that subsequent nomadic and sedentary peoples adapted to their own political requirements. As we reach the conclusion of this comprehensive examination of Cimmerian history, it becomes clear that their legacy extends far beyond the immediate chronological boundaries of their political existence. From their origins in the North Pontic steppes through their dramatic military campaigns across Anatolia and the Near East, the Cimmerians represent a crucial link in the chain of cultural transmission that connected the nomadic world with sedentary civilizations throughout antiquity. Their transformation from historical actors into legendary figures demonstrates the remarkable durability of cultural memory and the complex processes through which ancient peoples continue to influence modern consciousness. The Cimmerians ultimately achieved a form of immortality that their greatest warriors could never have imagined, living on not merely in archaeological remains and ancient texts, but in the collective imagination of humanity itself, forever embodying the fierce independence and martial prowess of the nomadic peoples who shaped the ancient world.